Hi there, I'm the Macabre, and I'm here to assist you today. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel before you watch it, since I know you use it to fall asleep. What time are you viewing right now, and where are you from? Relax and take a seat back. It started one night in November when our family's routine seemed to develop without incident. My parents' one-story home was spacious but somewhat odd in its layout, with a long and dark corridor connecting the entrance with the rooms at the back that made the echoes of footsteps more than usual at the time. My brothers and I were still living with my parents, and that night, my sister and I were at a friend's house, a few minutes away. It happened more than 20 years ago in a quiet neighborhood in the south of Mexico City, and even now, my mother still haunts the memory of that night. Streets away, my older brother had stayed at school for some activities, and the youngest had gone out with my dad. Only my mom was at home. My mother was always a practical person, with a kind of obsession with saving water and electricity. As soon as we all went out, she turned off the lights in the house, leaving only a small lamp on in the living room. She barely lit the armchair where she sat to look at a magazine. It was a quiet night, and the breeze that came through the cracks of the windows seemed to be the only sound. Suddenly he heard the noise of the front door opening, followed by the slight creaking of the interior door closing. He looked up surprised, because he was not expecting anyone so soon. It had barely been an hour since my dad had gone out with my younger brother. Then he heard Pa that echoed down the corridor were firm, heavy footsteps, identical to my father's. When my mom looked up to the end of the hallway, she saw his silhouette advancing towards her. My dad's figure stopped at the edge of the room, a couple of meters from where my mother was sitting. He had a strange expression, as if he had just seen something he couldn't process. His eyes seemed full of scary "and it's all right?" my mother asked, restless. Noticing that I was alone, my dad didn't answer. He simply looked away and walked to the main room. Something in his attitude didn't add up. My mom felt that the atmosphere in the house had changed suddenly. An inexplicable cold. She walked around the room, unable to sit still, got up and went after him, turned on the main light in the room. But he had already entered the room, and closed the door. "Please tell me what's going on," he shouted from the hallway, but got no desperate response. He turned on all the lights in the corridor as he advanced towards the room. At that moment the sound of the front door was heard again. He turned his head back, his heart pounding. When he reached the entrance, he saw my younger brother entering the house with a carefree expression. However, what happened next almost made her faint. Behind my brother, with the same clothes she had seen minutes before, came my father. My mother felt that her legs were failing her when she saw them enter together. She had to lean against the wall to avoid falling to the ground. My brother, alarmed, ran to her and asked her what was happening. My father also approached, quickly holding her arm. "What do you have?" "Are okay," he said with evident concern. She could barely speak. She pointed to the hallway with a trembling hand, trying to articulate what she had seen. "You were here, Case, for a moment. You passed through the hallway and entered the room babbling with bulging eyes." My father and my brother exchanged confused glances. My father shook his head, trying to calm her down. "No, we're just arriving. We went for some things." "What are you talking about?" "Market." "Calm down," he said. My mother persisted. She was certain of what she had seen, even if a hint of worry was starting to appear in his voice. Something wasn't right. So she took hold of my brother's arm and requested him to look around the main area. My dad also made the decision to go with him, although it seemed more to reassure her than because they believed that they would find something out of the ordinary. They turned on the lights in all the rooms as they passed the normally dark corridor, and silent. Now it felt eerily long, as if the shadow was more than usual in the corners. When they reached the main room, they found it empty. The windows were closed except for one whose curtain was fluttering slightly in the breeze. My father went to it and checked that it was wide open. "You left this open?" he asked as he looked outside. My mother shook her head with a brisk shake of her head. "I didn't close them all the windows as soon as you came out," she replied in a broken voice. "Checked the rest of the house, but there was no sign of intruders. Everything seemed to be in place." Yet my mother kept shaking, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone had been there that night. My mother couldn't sleep. Every little noise, from the creaking of the wood to the sound of the wind hitting the windows, made her startle. She insisted on keeping the lights on throughout the house, something she normally hated because of her obsession with saving electricity. My father tried to comfort her, but it was evident that he was also nervous, although he didn't say it. Something in his eyes reflected doubt, as if he couldn't explain what my mother had described. The next morning everything had returned to normal. However, my mother couldn't help but glance sideways at the hallway every time he passed by, as if hoping to find something or someone. In the end, he decided not to talk about it anymore, thinking that maybe it had all been a product of fatigue or his imagination. But things began to take a stranger turn in the following days. First, it was the photo album. Weeks after that one was not the time we were looking for images for a school project, we noticed that a family album was missing. It was among the most significant. Those big ones full of childhood memories that my mother cared for with special affection. We searched all over the house, but it didn't show up. The most disturbing thing was that my mother confessed with obvious nervousness that she had last seen him on the dresser in the master bedroom exactly the same night the incident occurred. From then on, the house stopped feeling like our home. There was something different. A weight on the atmosphere that you all notice was a sensation difficult to describe, as if someone else was always present, watching us from the shadows. As the days went by, the restlessness in the house became a constant. It was no longer just my mother who felt that strange presence. We all began to perceive it. The silence before comforting now seemed to amplify every little sound. The shadows in the corners seemed to move slightly, and the feeling of being observed, it became unbearable every time someone was left alone. My mother became more withdrawn. I insisted that all the lights stay on at night, especially those in the hallway. She had always been a rational and strong woman, but after that incident she looked exhausted, as if something was slowly draining her. One night while we were having dinner in the dining room, we were all startled. If something heavy had fallen to the floor. My father, who had been skeptical up to that point, immediately got up to investigate, took a lamp that we had at hand, and advanced cautiously towards the source of the noise. We remained silent, listening to his footsteps resonate on the floor. We saw him stop in front of the main room from our position in the dining room. We could only see his silhouette illuminated by the dim light of the lamp. What happened? My mother asked, nervously. My father didn't answer immediately. He entered the room and disappeared from our sight. A few seconds later he came back holding something in his hands. It was a picture frame, one that was previously hanging on the wall of the hallway. Right at the entrance of the room the glass was broken, and the photograph, one of the whole family, was covered with small cracks where the glass had fractured. This was lying on the floor. But the wall has no signs that the nail has come off, he said in a serious voice. We all went over to inspect the nail. It was still firmly embedded in the wall. It was as if someone had ripped off the frame and thrown it to the ground forcefully. We tried to find a logical explanation, but there was nothing to justify what had just happened that night. We all decided to sleep together in the living room. My mother was too nervous to stay in her room, and we preferred not to leave her alone. We laid mattresses on the floor and tried to sleep under the warm light of the main lamp, but sleep didn't come easily. Sometime in the early morning, I was the first to hear it. A faint murmur, as if someone was talking in the corridor. I stood motionless, holding my breath, trying to make sure I was able to sleep in the room. That it wasn't my imagination. My sister heard it too, and she grabbed my arm tightly, letting me know that I wasn't the only one who felt that way. We woke up my parents, and my father, determined to show that there was nothing to be afraid of, got up and walked to the end of the corridor, turning on every light in his path. But when he got there, he found nothing. That was the first time my father acknowledged that something wasn't right, despite his best efforts to maintain a quiet facade for us. He stopped in front of the main room and locked the door, saying, "I don't know what's going on, but I'm not going to let anyone in there whatever," as he put the key in his pocket. The days that followed were even more tense, and my mother insisted that no one open the door. Although my father had the key stored in a safe place, whenever any noise was heard in the house, everyone was something explainable. But the feeling of being observed was still present, like a constant shadow that did not leave us in peace. One night, shortly before going to sleep, my mother gathered courage enough to tell us something he'd been hiding. He sat down with us in the living room and with a trembling voice began to relate what he'd really seen that first night. "It wasn't just that I saw your dad, it was something else," he said as he fiddled nervously with his hands when he looked at me from the end of the hallway. His eyes weren't his, there was something strange about them, as if it wasn't him, as if something was imitating him. But he looked at us all wrong, waiting for our reactions. No one said anything. The silence in the living room was as heavy as the atmosphere of the house. "I didn't want to say it before because I thought he wouldn't believe me well," he continued. But I'm sure it wasn't your father, and the worst thing is that I don't know what my father was, although I didn't want to accept it completely. He also seemed disturbed by his words. Something in his expression reflected that he could not dismiss the possibility that my mother was telling the truth. The days passed and the incidents continued. The lights flickered for no apparent reason. Objects changed places, and at night there always seemed to be movement in the corridor. Even though we were never able to locate anybody, the stress became so bad that one morning at the crack of dawn, my father eventually took an extreme step. One day he brought an acquaintance of his, an old man who, they said, knew how to clean houses of bad energies. My mother, although she was not a superstitious person, accepted the help without hesitation. She could not stand one more minute of that presence that seemed to consume us. The man went through every corner of the house calmly, stopping for a longer time in the main room, whispering something that we could not understand while sprinkling holy water and passing a bouquet of herbs on the walls. When he finished, he left the room with a serious expression and told us here. There was something that does not belong to this place, but it is no longer there. He asked us not to talk any more about what happened and to try to live normally. According to him, as long as we did not give him power with our fear, he would not return. However, the tranquility he promised never came completely. Although the incidents diminished, the feeling of discomfort never went away from then on. My father made sure to be with my mother constantly when he retired. The main room was still locked even though it was never used again, and the lights in the hallway were always on. My mother was never left alone at home again. According to my mother, the thought of anything odd being in the room doesn't scare her the most. But the thought that whatever it was may return at some point, and if it does, he worries that he won't confine himself to copying my father. As you read Gale, Sekera in Arl, a little town lost in time, where an elderly man called Stephen resided. He was a reclusive guy who enjoyed taking lengthy walks at nightfall while attached to the forest. Nobody knew for certain what he was doing there, and nobody dared to approach him. Some said he was looking for mushrooms, while others claimed he was a frustrated botanist. He assumed he didn't notice the inquisitive child who chose to follow him one day. The little boy watched him walk through the trees until he reached a clearing where a rickety hut stood, which seemed to breathe to the rhythm of the wind. Sten stopped in front of the door, muttered something unintelligible, and entered. The boy hiding behind some bushes trembled with excitement and fear. Minutes later the old man came out carrying something in his hands, a small wooden box carved with strange symbols that seemed to move under the light of the setting sun. Then Stephen looked up and fixed his eyes on the OS where the boy was hidden. "You know what happens when you open something that doesn't belong to you?" he asked in a voice that seemed to drag centuries of dust and secrets. The boy didn't answer. He ran away without looking back, and when he got to town he told everything. But no one believed him. No one except you. Why? Because you know that legends always have some truth. It's not like that. Yes, I know. This has absolutely nothing to do with what you expected. When you started reading, this is not the horror book that they promised you. I'm sure you're already there frowning, confused, wondering if you got the story wrong. I can see you clearly the way your eyes squint skeptically, like your fingers tense over the screen. You thought you'd find the usual here: spirits, demons, curses, vampires, murders, or some undead. It's funny. You always are. You readers think you're in control. They think you can turn the pages and decide when to finish. But not. Here. This time this isn't just any story, and if you're wondering, no, you didn't get here by accident. This book isn't for your entertainment. This book is to distract you while you're reading these words. Something's going on as you're trying to figure out what I mean by all this, and you're wondering if you should keep reading or find something lighter to pass the time. I have a suggestion. Hide. I bet you didn't hear when he walked in through the back door. You also didn't hear your pet's last sighs, or your relatives' desperate efforts to survive peacefully. I didn't come to hurt you, I just am. I am the messenger, the narrator. My only tool is the word, but he's not playing. He's in your house. He came in a few minutes ago. I warned you to hide. I told you this was just a distraction. But of course you didn't take me seriously. Don't look back, it doesn't make sense. It's already there. This won't end well for you, no matter how much you pray. In fact, that only irritates it more. It makes it creative. If it were you, I would do the same. I would turn off the cell phone and cover my head. But honestly, it's already late. It's just a few steps from you. You hear it. Your heart beats faster. I'm sure you can feel it. That presence, that cold breath on your neck. This is going to make ugly, very ugly. I'd better leave after all. I'm just the narrator. No, this story is disturbing. At an hour when I write it, I feel a knot in my stomach. It was an experience that marked my childhood and, although I find it hard to believe, even now I can't deny what I lived. The only thing I know for sure is that I had never felt so scared as that time. It all happened several years ago. Years old, when I was just 11, I was always a serious and reserved child. My parents, concerned about my lack of interaction with other children, used to encourage me to spend more time with my cousins and other family members, although I never really felt comfortable. The only exception was Arturo, the son of my godparents. We had a special relationship, and despite our differences we got along well. That's why when my parents let me pass a night at their house, they were happy that I was willing to socialize. I remember that night was different. My godparents invited us to dinner, and after a while of jokes and games they proposed that I stay overnight there. They also said that the next day we would go to a beach about 2 hours away. The idea excited me. My parents exceeded delighted to see that I was enthusiastic that night. Arturo and we played until late. We laughed so much that even my godfather joined in for a while. But when it was time to sleep, something strange began to happen. I didn't stop having disturbing dreams. I woke up again and again, panting as if I was short of breath, with a tightness in my chest that made me feel like I was drowning. Arturo tried to comfort me by saying that I surely missed my parents. I didn't want to worry like that. I tried to ignore my discomfort and went back to sleep the following day. We left early for the beach, and although it was a tiring trip, it was worthwhile because we had a great time swimming and collecting shells on the shore. We got home at sunset, exhausted but content, and after dinner, we quickly went to bed. Arturo had a small but cozy room with a bunk bed that he shared with his cousins when they came to visit him. The upstairs bed was full of toys, so he always slept in the downstairs bed. That night, Arturo offered me the lower bed again, as he had the night before, but he fell asleep before I could tell him that I preferred that location. I chose the upper bunk, moved the toys out of the room, and settled down. I felt weird, as if someone was watching me, but I tried to calm down. I turned on my watch light and noticed that it was 11 o'clock. I lay looking at the ceiling and wishing that time would pass faster. It was then, when I heard something, a slight noise, like someone was moving the toys on the floor. At first I thought it was Arturo, but when I looked down I saw him fast asleep with one arm hanging out of bed. The sound persisted, a soft creak between the toys, as if something was moving between them. I stared into the corner where their action figures were, lit only by the dim light coming in through the window. At first I saw nothing, but then a shadow moved between the toys, something small about the size of a child. My heart stopped for a moment. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, but what I saw then, it completely paralyzed me. That figure came out from among the toys and was within reach of the light, and the most disturbing thing was my face. I couldn't move. My breathing became heavy and I felt the cold run through my whole body. That figure that looked like a small child, it had my features. It was as if I was seeing a distorted reflection of me, but the worst thing was the way he moved. He didn't walk like a normal person, but he moved spasmodically, like an animal stalking its prey. While watching that thing slowly approached Arthur, who was still fast asleep. His posture was almost like that of a predator examining his victim. He leaned over him as if he were sniffing. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make any sound. I was completely paralyzed by desperate fear. I looked for something, anything I could use to stop it. Near my pillow was one of the toys I had put aside before going to bed, a rather heavy metal car. I took it with trembling hands, and without thinking too much I threw it with all my might towards the figure. The noise was deafening. In the stillness of the night, the car hit the floor with a roar, and that thing was he turned sharply towards me. At that moment, I saw clearly how his face changed. It was no longer exactly mine. It was a grotesque version with empty eyes and a smile that did not seem human. Then that figure ran back towards the toys. It moved so fast that it seemed to fade into the shadows. Everything was silent for a moment, except for my accelerated breathing and the echo of my heart resounding in my ears. But I knew that I was still there, hidden among the toys, watching me curl, what against the wall, trying to make me as small as possible. I wanted to wake up Arturo, but the fear of making noise and attracting that thing was greater. After a couple of minutes that seemed like hours, I dared to look at the toys. They were exactly as before, except for one. A new figure that had not been there before was watching me from the floor. It was me again. My face, but clearer. This time it seemed to be waiting for me. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if I was short of breath. I had to get out of there without thinking. I let myself fall from the bunk. The blow was strong, and I felt a sharp pain in my head as I hit the floor. The noise woke up Arturo, who looked at me dazed from his bed. I was unable to speak, so I just pointed to the toys while crying. My godparents came in quickly after they saw me on the floor and took me to the kitchen, where they put ice on my head. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words did not come out. I kept saying that I did not want to go back to the room, and they agreed to let us stay in the living room, putting a movie on to help us relax. Arturo stayed, and I fell asleep quickly on the couch, but I couldn't close my eyes every time. I felt as though this thing was still in the room, hidden among the toys, waiting, and even from the living room, I could hear a snow crackling. I'm not sure when I managed to close my eyes, but it must have been early in the morning, when the first light of the day started to peek through the windows. But even in my dream, I couldn't rest. I got the impression that someone was watching me, and I kept seeing that figure in my head, my face hiding in the shadows. My godparents were not there. Arturo was still sound asleep on the couch, and the living room was quiet when I woke up. I thought they were making breakfast in the kitchen. I cautiously stood up, still in a haze, and made the decision to go to the room to get my belongings. As quickly as possible, I wanted to be prepared to go. I halted when I saw that the room's door was open. There was a faint hum that I could hardly hear. I caught my breath and carefully pushed the door. The room was just as we had left it the previous evening, with the bunk bed in the middle and the toys strewn all over the floor, but something had been left there. Changed, the action figures that were always in chaotic positions were now perfectly lined up, looking towards the door. My heart started pounding. I felt something wasn't right, but I needed my things. I walked in with shaky steps, trying not to look too much at the toys. I walked over to the bunk bed and grabbed my backpack that was hanging in the corner just as I was going to turn to leave. The murmur came back this time. The loudest came from among the toys. My body froze. I turned my head slowly to the corner where the figures were. There was nothing out of the ordinary at first, but when I looked closer I saw something that made a shiver run down my spine. In the center of the figures there was that thing again. Now I was the size of a child, with my face distorted and a mocking expression that I understood her lips were moving, but she didn't emit clear words, just that disturbing murmur that seemed to fill the room. I don't know where I got the courage from, but I grabbed my backpack and ran out of the room, closing the door behind me. As soon as I got to the living room I began to cry. My godparents arrived at that moment, alarmed by my bland state. I asked them to take me home. I didn't explain anything. I didn't want me to if they thought I was making things up. The return trip was silent. Arturo tried to talk to me, but as soon as I answered, as soon as we got home, I ran to hug my parents. I told them I didn't want to go back to my godparents' house. Never again. They didn't insist. Maybe because they saw the fear in my eyes. That night I tried to sleep in my bed, but the sound of the toys moving kept resonating in my head for a long time. Weeks I dreamed of that figure even now. Years later I can't remember that experience without feeling a knot in my stomach. I never knew what it was. It was something real, a spirit, a reflection of my deepest fears. All I know is that it wasn't human and that it had my face 333 gale dry. The deal should be going through. Just now the ticking clock ticked every second like a hammer blow, racing my heart, mouth dry, hands trembling. My whole body was a bundle of nerves and doubts. What was going on? This was not part of the plan. It could not be all. My sacrifice had been in vain. I looked around. The yellow candles spread a dim light, barely enough to illuminate the room. The corners were lost in impenetrable shadows, and the citrus aroma of lemon permeated the air, as dense as the suffocating heat that made my skin burn. Sweat trickled down my face, soaking my neck before disappearing into the damp fabric of my t-shirt. My breathing was a gasping and an irritating tingle pooling in my throat, accompanied by an oppressive emptiness in my lungs, my head throbbing, pounding, as if it were about to burst. I closed my eyes and tried to take a deep breath. The burning air barely. I managed to calm a little the tension that chains me when I opened them. My gaze was fixed on the scene in front of me, the blood and the offering. A lump tightened my throat when I saw my brother. He was lying on his back, with arms and legs outstretched, surrounded by candles that formed a pentagram. Now consumed halfway, the thick and dark blood covered his neck and chest. His face remained frozen in an expression of pure terror, like a mute echo of his last moments before the knife cut his life short. My eyes filled with tears. The memory was a relentless blow. The knife, the scream, the blood. I tremble like a leaf. A murderer, a beast. The tears fell uncontrollably, mixing with the sweat that ran down my skin. I looked away at the clock, looking for a distraction. I tried to tell the time, but my vision, everything was cloudy. The lights were distorted, the sounds were distorted, the heat suffocated. The smell of the sidewalk and lemon was mixed with something metallic, a penetrating smell of blood that turned my stomach. My legs hit, and the cold and sticky ground received me with a sharp blow. The air seemed to express itself with each second, turning my breathing into a tortuous effort. I closed my eyes, seeking refuge in the darkness. I don't know when I lost knowledge. When I woke up, the room was illuminated by daylight. I blinked several times, disoriented. My body felt heavy, numb. As I looked around, I noticed that something was terribly wrong. The candles had disappeared, as had my brother's body. There were only remains of being scattered on the floor. A chill ran down my spine. What had happened? With hesitant steps, I approached the door, leaning against the wall so as not to fall. Then I saw it, a white envelope peeking out from under the door. I picked it up with trembling hands. When I opened it, I found a letter with the logo of the film studio I had auditioned. I read the words over and over again, as if my mind refused to process them. Dear sir, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to embody the role of the protagonist in our next production. Your talent and dedication they have left impressed. Congratulations. My breathing stopped. The envelope fell to the ground. It worked. The sacrifice had been accepted. But I felt no joy or relief. I looked at the place where before, and I did. My brother's body was euphoric. All my life I dreamed of this moment, and now Phoenix Productions, the most prestigious studio in Arlet, had chosen my talent. But I felt nothing, neither happiness nor pain, only emptiness. An abysmal void that devoured all his time. Several years ago, when I worked as a transporter, had involved me in an episode that I will never forget. It is something that is very difficult for me to tell, but I feel that sharing it can help me to free a little of the burden. I was driving on a remote highway in northern Mexico, a route that I already knew, but that never left me completely calm. That day I had been driving for more than 8 hours without stopping, because I did not want the night to catch me on the road. At that time, these routes were dangerous, not only because of the accidents, but also because of the insecurity that reigned in the region. However, time won me over. The sun hid behind the mountains, and darkness covered the road like a heavy blanket. During all that time, I had ignored the urge to go to the bathroom, but my body couldn't wait any longer. There were no gas stations nearby, and the urgency forced me to make a decision. Stop in a deserted stretch to relieve myself quickly. I parked the truck carefully on the shore, turned off the lights, and with the cell phone in hand to light up, I went in. Just a few minutes. Footsteps in the bush. The silence of the night was unsettling, and the darkness seemed to absorb everything that the light of my flashlight could not reach. As I hurried, I heard a murmur. It was something faint, like voices in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to see through the trees, but there was no one. It must be my imagination, I said to myself, although my instinct warned me that something was not right. I decided to hurry and return to the truck, but before I took the last step out of the brush, I clearly heard a whisper. Help, please. They were desperate male voices, but barely audible, as if they didn't have the strength to scream. I froze. Fear ran through my body, but something inside me wouldn't let me leave. And if someone really needs help, I thought. My stomach was twisting and my legs were shaking, but I took a few more steps, lighting the way with the flashlight. With every step I took, the voices seemed to fade away, but something inexplicable pushed me to follow the mountain. It became denser. The tall and dry trees rose like sinister shadows in the darkness. Suddenly the silence was absolute. There were no more murmurs, only the rustling of the leaves under my feet and the sound of my agitated breathing. I was about to turn around when I heard a cry. This time it was clearer, more real. Raising the flashlight, I looked for the origin of the sound. I couldn't see anything around me. I glanced up. At that moment, what I never thought I would ever see in my life was two corpses hanging on one of the heaviest branches of a dry tree, swinging gently in the breeze. The night was still until I screamed, a cry of fear, powerlessness, and incredulity. The two young men's corpses had open wounds that were obviously caused by a knife. I was immobile, and I almost dropped the cell phone due to my trembling hands. The image seemed like it was from a horror film. The night felt colder, and for a moment I was at a loss for what to do. Only when fear paralyzed me completely, I reacted. I turned on my heels and ran towards the truck, tripping over the roots and branches that stood in my way. I climbed into the truck almost out of breath, my heart beating so hard I felt like it was going to pop out of my chest. I slammed the doors shut and started the engine with trembling hands as the vehicle started. My thoughts were in chaos. I couldn't help but see the image of those bodies in my mind. Something inside me was screaming that I must do something, but I was also dead out of fear. I drove a few kilometers until I found an area with a signal on my cell phone. From there, I called the authorities anonymously. As soon as I could describe what I had seen, my voice broke and the words mixed with a lump in my throat. Although I tried to stay calm, my mind kept spinning. After hanging up, I turned off the phone. I didn't want to be located or get involved more than necessary. While I was still driving the dark road, and void seemed to be stretching on infinitely. I couldn't stop thinking about those young people, about how they had ended up there, in that place so isolated and macabre. But even more disturbing was remembering the voices I heard before. It was they who called me, or my mind was playing with me. The weight of those questions chased me like a shadow. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing by warning to the authorities, I couldn't help but feel guilt. Something inside me told me that those souls asked for more than just to be found. I felt that they had looked for me, that somehow I was part of something that I could not understand. When I arrived at my destination, and I tried to resume my normal life, but everything had changed. The nights were longer and the days heavier. The image of the bodies hanging in the branches, it wouldn't let me sleep. I woke up in the early morning with the echo of those words, "Help, please." Weeks passed, and although I searched for news about what happened, I never found anything. Not a single report, not a single mention in the newspapers or on television. It was as if nothing had happened. That lack of information left me even more restless. The authorities really found them, or everything was forgotten, buried by in the silence of the night. I pray for those young people every day. I hope they have found rest, that their souls have found peace. But what I experienced that night remains in me like an open wound. I never took that road again, nor drove at night on lonely roads. That place, those voices, and those bodies were forever etched in my memory, as a reminder that evil can take it where it is least we hope. Although telling this helps me a little, I know that I will never be able to erase what I saw. Is a weight that I carry with me, and I probably will until the last day of my life. I do not lead an exciting life, but I do have peace of mind. I am 38 years old, I am single, and I have no children. There are those who see this as something depressing, but honestly I do not care. I have a stable job, a modest house, and I do not owe explanations to no one. Worked as a bartender in an exclusive bar on the rooftop of a luxury building in the center of a neighboring city. It is a place attended by only people who consider that common bars are below them. Although I do not live at that level of luxury, my house is located in a simple neighborhood about 30 minutes away. Despite that, working there has its advantages. Tips: the customers are excellent. They don't skimp on spending money, and the rotating public keeps everything interesting. The bar has no regular customers, which I personally enjoy. Maybe I'm reserved, or I just prefer to avoid unnecessary ties. By the way, my name is Mauricio. It won't seem important now, but it will be later. It was a Friday night, the busiest day of the week. The place was crowded as usual. Groups of friends toasting couples on romantic dates, and some who had probably just come to feel important. I like to watch people and try to guess who they are really just by how they order their drinks. Those who order complicated cocktails usually want to impress someone. Those who order whiskey alone have probably had a bad day. I was on the lookout for a couple at the end of the bar who was finishing their last glasses of wine, ready to offer them another round before they asked me. Everything was going normally until I noticed the arrival of someone who from the first moment felt out of place. It was a man who caught my attention immediately. He was stiff, with clenched teeth and a frown as if he were furious. He had messy black hair, almost like a nest falling on his forehead. His clothes were simple, a black sweater and a jacket made of old, faded leather with stains that seemed to have been uncleaned for years. But what disturbed me the most was his face. There was something in his expression that made him look dangerous. The man walked straight to the bar but didn't sit down, just stood there staring at me. I wondered how he had passed the doorman to stay professional. I cleared my throat and asked him what he wanted to drink. My tone was neutral, although I couldn't ignore the strange vibe emanating. He didn't respond immediately. He just continued to look at me as if he was evaluating himself. Finally, he muttered that he wanted a double of dark liquor. I nodded and poured him without arguing. Although it was not a common drink in that place where customers preferred something of higher quality, I left the glass in front of him and continued to serve others. When I returned to collect from him, he threw a crumpled bill on the bar. It was also strange since almost no one paid in cash. He didn't say anything else while he was collecting, and when he was about to close the matter he spoke again. His words left me cold. "I knew I would find you here, Mauricio." My mind stopped. I looked him straight in the eyes, trying to process what he had just said. I put down the glass he was holding and demanded to know how he knew my name. My voice was low but firm. I wanted to make it clear that I was serious. The man didn't answer my question. He just stared at me for a few seconds before muttering something that completely paralyzed me. "I know what you did," before I could react or ask what he meant. He turned and headed towards the elevators. I wanted to yell at him or follow him, but I was on my turn and I couldn't abandon my responsibilities. I stood in a daze, wondering who that man was and what the hell did he want from me that night. When my shift was over, I drove home quietly, but I couldn't get out of my head what had happened. "I know what you did." His words were echoing in my mind as I searched unsuccessfully for a logical explanation. That night I came home with my head full of thoughts. My neighborhood was quiet, even though somewhat neglected, and my little house was at the end from a cul-de-sac. Despite the simplicity of the place, I had always felt safe there. But that night that security began to falter. I locked the door. Something I did automatically every day. Let's make sure you did what I had done. I wasn't a saint, but neither was anyone who was getting into serious trouble. I didn't even recognize the man, who he was, why he knew my name. None of that. It made sense. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but every shadow that moved out of the windows put me on alert. I finally turned off the light and went to bed. Although sleeping seemed impossible, my mind kept working, looking for an explanation. No matter how much I tried, I didn't find anything. Nothing to justify the strange interaction in the bar. When I finally managed to fall asleep, it was only to wake up suddenly, in the middle of the night. My body tensed instantly. Something had changed in the environment. I couldn't explain what it was, but I felt a strange presence, as if someone else was there with me. I opened my eyes slowly, letting it adjust to the darkness for a minute. I didn't see nothing out of the ordinary, but then my heart started racing. In the corner of my room, near the door, there was something, a dark figure motionless that didn't belong there. Fear washed over me like an icy wave. I didn't want to move. I pretended to stay asleep, waiting for that thing to go away. But it didn't. I was still there, watching myself, my mind repeating over and over again, "Someone is in my room." I was trying to convince me that it was a poorly formed shadow, a figment of my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was someone. I counted in my mind to 3, taking a deep breath to gather courage. Then I jumped up, screaming, ready to face whatever was there. But I didn't expect what happened. Instead of attacking me, the figure ran towards the door. I couldn't make out his face, but it was clear it was a person. While I was running away, I heard a thud. Something fell to the ground. I ran after it through the house, but when I got to the front door, it was already open. I looked outside towards the deserted street, but I didn't see anyone. My instinct told me not to go out. It could be a trap. Instead, I closed it, and let's make sure immediately. It was one of the knives in my kitchen. I felt a knot in my stomach that the person had come in with the intention of using it, maybe to kill me. At that point, I called the police. I needed help. When they arrived, they checked the house from top to bottom, as well as the small garden in the back. They found nothing, not even signs that someone had forced their way in. All the doors and windows were intact, just as I had left them before bed. That only made everything more terrifying. What he was, how he'd entered, and how he'd left so fast. Even though they had the security camera video, I provided the police a description of the guy I had seen in the pub, and they warned me that it may take some time to identify him. I had to exercise caution in the meantime. I tried to tell myself that the worst was behind me, but I couldn't deny that someone had entered my room with a knife drawn. I felt very exposed, defenseless, and invaded. With my bedroom door locked and the lights on, I sat on my bed for the remainder of the night. That was just the beginning of what was to come. The days that followed, they were a mixture of paranoia and exhaustion. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the house, every shadow out of the corner of my eye made me jump. I convinced myself that that man from the bar was watching me, waiting for another moment to attack. But the most disturbing thing of all was that I had no idea how he had entered that night. I checked every corner of the house over and over again, looking for a possible entrance that I had overlooked, but I found nothing. I decided to install security cameras throughout the house and change the locks. I spent more money than I should, but I couldn't stay calm otherwise. The policeman who took my statement called me to tell me that they were still reviewing the recordings of the bar. But until that moment they had no concrete clues about who the man was or how he had managed to disappear so quickly. Then something else happened. It was a Tuesday night when I was returning from work. My shift had ended late and fatigue weighed on me. While I parked the car in front of my house, I went down with the keys in hand and I noticed something strange. The front door was ajar. A shiver ran down my spine. I was sure I had locked and secured the door before leaving. I stood motionless for a moment, debating whether I should go in or call the police. But my curiosity, or maybe my desperation, was stronger. I pushed the door carefully and entered. The house was completely quiet, but everything seemed out of place. The armchair in the living room was moved. The kitchen drawers were open and some objects lying on the floor. It was evident that someone had been there. My heart was pounding as I moved slowly forward with a lamp in my hand as the only defensive object. He was on my bed as I ascended the stairs to my room. Something, a picture of myself shot from inside my bed, made me flinch in dread. House in the picture, I was asleep with the lights off exactly as I had been the night that intruder first appeared. I couldn't look at that photo. Not only confirmed that someone had been inside my house but had been watching me. The level of invasion was unbearable. I took the photo with trembling hands and headed for the door. I couldn't stay there for another minute, but just when I was about to leave, I heard something. A soft noise like a creak coming from the hallway. I turned slowly, focusing the lamp in the direction of the sound. For an instant everything was silent, but then I saw him, a shadow moving quickly towards the stairs. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew it was him. "Who you are?" I screamed with all my might, but the figure didn't answer. He stopped for a second at the end of the corridor, staring at me before turning and appearing downstairs. I ran after him with adrenaline pumping in my veins. I went down the steps 2 by 2, but when I got to the ground floor, the front door was open again, swinging in the wind. I went out into the garden looking in all directions, but there was no sign of anyone, only the echo of my screams breaking the silence of the night. I called the police for the second time that week. When they arrived, they checked the house and the garden, but again they didn't find anything. I showed them the photo they had left on my bed, but the only thing they could do was add it to the report. According to them, there was not much more to do until they found the person responsible. That night I did not sleep at my house again. I stayed in a nearby hotel, afraid that the intruder would return. But even in the room from the hotel, I felt that someone was watching me. The fear was no longer something I could leave behind. It had become my constant companion. The question that tormented me the most was, why me? What had I done to deserve this? And then, like lightning, a thought struck me. Maybe it was not what I had done, but what they believed I had done. The following days passed in a state of constant paranoia. I returned home just to pick up the essentials, and I continued to stay in hotels, changing places every night to avoid feeling vulnerable. However, I knew that this was not sustainable. My work and my daily life began to suffer, but the fear of returning was too great. Finally, after a week of evasion, I decided to face the problem. I returned home with the aim of finding an answer. If that man returned, I'd be prepared. I bought a lock for the door, reinforced the windows, and stowed a baseball bat by my bed. Regaining control was all I wanted. I was not alone when I heard a board creaking on the hallway floor that night as I was sitting in my living room with the lights on. It made my blood cold. My breathing was labored, and I could feel it as I picked up the bat and moved slowly in the direction of the sound. Sweat trickled down my brow as I made my way to the hallway and searched everywhere, but I knew I wasn't dreaming. Someone was hiding somewhere in the house. I walked cautiously to my room, my heart outstretched like a drum. The door opened, something I obviously didn't remember doing, and then I saw it. The man was standing by the window, staring at me with a look that was a mix of satisfaction and rage. "What the hell do you want?" I screamed, lifting the bat. He remained motionless, but his words were more frightening than any action he could have taken. "I want you to pay for what you did." My legs felt like jelly, and I had no idea what he meant. All I could say was, "I don't know what you're about." Speaking, the man took a step towards me, and I raised the bat as a warning. However, he did not try to attack me. Instead, he took something out of his pocket, a crumpled photo that he threw on the ground in front of me. When I picked it up, my mind went blank. It was an image of a wrecked car, a clearly deadly accident scene. At the bottom of the photo, written in black ink, was my name. "You remember it now?" he asked with a hateful voice. Fear gave way to confusion. I didn't recognize the accident or understand that it had to do with me, but he wouldn't let me answer. "It was you. You caused this. You killed my sister." My mind was spinning, trying to find some sense. I didn't remember having been involved in any accident, but the man's look was that of someone who was absolutely convinced of his version. "That's not true," I said, my voice just a whisper. He didn't respond with sarcasm, moving forward one step further. "I know what you did. I've been following you ever since. I saw how you ran away, how you went on with your life as if nothing happened. But that's over. Today you're going to pay." I raised the bat hard, ready to defend myself if I tried anything. But at that moment, sirens were heard in the distance. I had called the police before entering the house as a precaution to hear the sound. The man gave me one last look of hatred and ran to the window before I could stop him, jumped over the frame and disappeared into the darkness. The officers arrived minutes later, but, as always, they found no trace of him. I gave them the photo of the accident, but without context or additional evidence, they couldn't do much. They told me that maybe it was a confusion, that the mind of someone traumatized can make enemies where there are none, but I wasn't so sure. Since that night, I have attempted to piece together every piece of my past in an attempt to find an explanation for the man's hatred toward me, but I have been unable to do so. I have no recollection of an accident or any connection to the scene in the photo he left, and even now, years later, I wonder if it was all a case of mistaken identity or if there is something buried in my memory that my mind won't bring to light. What I do know, though, is that every time I hear a crackle in the night or see a shadow move, I hope to never run into it again, because I don't know if I will be able to get away. If you made it this far, please leave a comment. I grew up in a household with a lot of supernatural tales, and I was born and raised in Mexico City. Despite my family's strong religious beliefs, I made an effort to rationalize every weird event I had. Nevertheless, there came a time in my life when I encountered something that I still find hard to comprehend. I was 17 at the time, and it was 2009. It was a special stage because I had started my first relationship. My girlfriend Mariana shared my fascination for the paranormal, which strengthened our bond. We both studied in an evening course and used to stay up late chatting in the empty corridors of the building. But that week everything changed. When I arrived at the course, I noticed something peculiar. One of the doormen of the building, he acted strangely with me. It was not that he ignored me exactly, but that he seemed not to perceive. His gaze passed through me as if he were not there. That feeling made me deeply uncomfortable, but I decided not to give it too much importance. That same week a group activity was organized. We had to explore the facilities to identify areas that required improvement. Mariana, 2 other colleagues, and I formed a team. We descended the stairs to the less traveled areas of the building. With each level we went down, the atmosphere became more gloomy. The walls were covered with humidity, and a rancid smell permeated the air. Finally, we arrived at a place that seemed completely abandoned. The most disturbing thing was that after several deteriorated floors, we came across a totally different level. This was clean, with impeccably white walls, as if someone had recently restored it. At the bottom of a long in the hallway, there was a large white door from which emanated disturbing sounds, muffled screams and murmurs. We looked at each other terrified, but no one had the courage to open that door. We decided to go back the way we had come. From that moment on, the following days were filled with strange events. I began to notice that several people in the building were watching me in a disturbing way, with smiles that seemed forced, almost human. Even the doormen, those who they always greeted us, now they did it with disturbing gestures. I tried to tell myself that everything had a rational explanation, even though I had a persistent knot in my gut. However, a night arrived that marked a before and after. Mariana and I made the decision to remain a little while later to chat. It was past 7 in the afternoon, and the building was almost deserted. We chose to walk to the second floor of a sector. In search of seclusion, the building's enclosed area was a sizable terrace with a stunning city view. In an attempt to unwind after the bizarre happenings of the previous days, we sat on the floor and began discussing anything. Everything seemed to be fine at first, But then the lights in the hallway started to flicker and eventually went out entirely. With the exception of the building's distant lights, the area was black. I tried not to alarm Mariana, but something inside me told me that we were not alone. Suddenly, the elevators began to work erratically. The doors opened and closed continuously. Although there seemed to be no one using them, the metallic sound echoed in the stillness of the empty floor. Mariana, strangely calm, suggested that it was an electrical failure, but I felt that there was something more as we tried to ignore what was happening. A security guard appeared in the hallway. When I saw him, I prepared to apologize, thinking that he was going to kick us out for being in a forbidden area. However, what happened left me cold. He walked past us as if we were not there. He didn't even look at us. It was as if we were completely invisible before he could process what happened. Another guard appeared almost identical to the previous one. This one also completely ignored us, but the most disturbing thing was his smile. An unnatural wide smile that gave me chills. I couldn't help but feel that something was deeply wrong with him. It was then, when something really scary happened. The doors of the sensors opened again, but this time something came out of there. It was a girl no more than 8 years old, hugging a worn-out backpack, walked slowly to the center of the hallway, and sat with her back to us. The air became heavy and an inexplicable cold ran through my body. When I looked at her in more detail, I realized something that paralyzed me. She had no face where her eyes, nose, and mouth should be. There was only a dense shadow like a dark mist that covered that part of her body. Mariana remained motionless, as if she had not noticed anything that was happening, with her heart about to explode. I quickly got up and took her arm, pulling her away from there without saying anything. I didn't want her to look at that thing, however. While I was trying to stay calm, I began to hear a disturbing sound. A childish laugh, but distorted as if it came from a badly tuned radio. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled Mariana towards the stairs and we ran down. Without looking back, we reached the main courtyard of the building. But even there we didn't feel safe. Some people who were around looked at us with those same macabre smiles, as if they knew something that we didn't. I finally accompanied her to the bus that would take her home, trying to appear calm. Mariana did not seem affected, which disconcerted me even more. As soon as she said goodbye with a quick kiss, and she got on the bus, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, already at home, I could not sleep. The image of the faceless girl and the sound of her laughter tormented me. She kept repeating to me that there had to be some logical explanation, but I couldn't find it. I decided that the next day I would talk to Mariana to try to understand what had happened the next day. As usual, I messaged Mariana as soon as I woke up. We spoke for a few seconds before I made the decision to ask her outright what had occurred the night before. She told me she didn't comprehend what had occurred and was perplexed. I was talking about how the night had been perfectly typical for her. This puzzled me. I insisted, trying to explain the events: the lights off, the elevators opening by themselves, the guards acting strange, and of course the faceless girl. Mariana was silent for a moment before answering. I didn't see any of that. I don't remember anything strange. For me, we were just talking, as always. Her words left me cold. How was it possible that there was I noticed nothing. Not the guards, not the lights, not the sound of the elevators, much less the girl. I felt a knot in my stomach while trying to process her words. Something didn't add up. You're sure? I asked, an incredulous of course. Yes, Jorge, I think you dreamed it, he answered calmly. That answer only made the uneasiness grow inside me. I knew it hadn't been a dream. Everything had been too real. The dampness in the hallway, the sound of laughter, the cold texture of Mariana's hand. When I pulled her, I couldn't have imagined it. As the day progressed, I tried to concentrate on my activities. But a sense of paranoia began to take hold of me. I felt that strangers on the street were staring at me, as some people in the building had done. There was something in their expressions that was unsettling to me, as if they knew something that I didn't know. That night, while I was trying to sleep, I got a message from Mariana telling me that she had had a strange nightmare. Although she didn't remember the details, she only mentioned that she felt a strange presence, something I couldn't describe, but that made her wake up scared. This message left me even more disturbed. The next day, I decided to go back to the building. This time, I just wanted to check if it had all been a bad move of my imagination or if really something strange was going on. I arrived early and I walked through the halls with the intention of going back down to the abandoned flats. However, I found that the entrance to the stairs was locked with a thick chain and a rusty padlock. It seemed like no one had accessed that part of the building in years. When I tried to ask one of the doormen why they had closed that section, his answer left me frozen. Which? Young section. There is nothing closed here. Those floors do not exist. I did not know what to say. I just felt and I walked away. But something in his expression made me feel that he was not telling me the whole truth. That same afternoon I decided never to return to that place to this day. I do not know what I saw in that building or why, Mariana. She did not perceive it. What I know is that I will never forget the face or the absence of it of that girl or the distorted echo of her laughter. Sometimes on the quietest nights I think I hear it again as a distant whisper that reminds me that there are things in this world that we can never understand. More than 2 decades ago I have experienced paranormal encounters that, although disturbing, have not deterred me from traveling. I love to travel the country with my family, exploring unknown places. But there is one trip in particular that marked me forever, and when I remember it, a chill runs through my body. It was the summer of 2003. And my wife was pregnant with our first child. We had planned a getaway for my days off. Looking for a quiet destination where we could relax, I decided to take us to a town called San Jacinto del Llano, in the state of Guanajuato. My boss had recommended that place to me, highlighting its hospitality and idyllic landscapes. I had never been to that region, but his enthusiasm convinced me that afternoon. After packing what we needed, we left home around 7 p.m. Always preferred night trips. The roads are more mirrored and the heat is much more tolerable. Everything seemed perfect. The excitement of setting out on the road was full the car, and my wife kept her cheers, commenting on what she expected from the town. The first hours passed normally. The road was dark, but the clear sky let the light of the stars guide our journey. It was almost at 3 in the morning when we finally saw the lights of the town in the distance from the road. San Jacinto del Llano seemed catching, with warm lanterns illuminating the streets. I accelerated, a little anxious to arrive and rest. However, something disturbed me. When entering its streets there were many people outside. Despite the time, it was not normal to see so much activity in the early morning, and much less in such a small place. But the strangest thing was not their quantity, but their behavior. All these people were stuck to the walls, completely motionless, staring at the surface of the buildings. It made me so uncomfortable that I couldn't help but comment on it. It's strange that there are so many people awake at this hour, I said, looking for my wife's reaction. Maybe it's something typical of the place, who knows? She replied, although their tone denoted the same intrigue. I continued driving slowly. What disturbed me the most was that none of them seemed to notice our presence. They didn't turn, they didn't look at us, they were all motionless, as if they were part of the same walls they were on. Stuck together, we noticed something else, and they were dressed in white linen suits. Nevertheless, I made the decision to drive on toward the town center, even though my instinct told me something was wrong. When we reached the central plaza, people were everywhere, glued to the walls or staring at the ground. I wanted to avoid getting out of the car, but the exhaustion of the day made us find somewhere to stay. We came across a large red sign that read Posada San Jose, which was not the motel my boss had mentioned, but it seemed like a respectable place to spend the night. I parked in front of the inn, turned off the engine, and when I got out of the car, I felt a chill. It was then that we noticed it slowly. People began to turn towards us. Their movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, and when they finally looked at us, it was as if the same gesture had been synchronized between them. They all smiled in a way that was unnatural. To see people turn towards us, a sense of alarm came over me. Their faces were indescribably disturbing, each of them showing a huge and strange smile, with perfectly aligned teeth and exaggeratedly thick lips. Their cheeks, they were marked, almost sunken, as if they had been sculpted. But the most disturbing thing was their empty, lifeless eyes, but fixed on us. My wife took my arm tightly. "What is this? What is wrong with them?" she whispered, trying not to disturb the strange environment. I could not respond. An instinctive impulse told me that we should get away as soon as possible, but my logic asked me to calm down. Maybe they were just strange villagers. Maybe there was a reason for all this. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. I decided that the best thing to do was to quickly enter the inn and rest, maybe inside. It would all make more sense. I said, "Good night," in a strained voice, to the group of individuals who were now lifting their hands, and they all followed suit in perfect unison. "Good night," they said in a monotone, raising their hands. I was caught between interest and terror, yet their voices were the same, like a woman squeezing my arm and whispering, "This is not normal, please." We quickly made our way to the inn's entrance, and as I opened it, I could sense how those eyes followed us around without blinking. It was a comfort when the air from within entered. But not for long. The reception was deserted. There was a bell on the counter, so I pressed it. The echo of the sound echoed through the room. Everything seemed clean and tidy, but there was no sign of life. We waited a few minutes, but no one showed up. "We can't stay here," my wife said, now visibly nervous. I nodded something. It was terribly wrong. As we were about to leave, the sound of footsteps turned us to a back door. A middle-aged man dressed in an impeccable uniform came in slowly. His face showed the same smile as the people outside. He walked with calculated movements as if every step was rehearsed. "Welcome to the San Jose Inn," he said in the same uniform voice that we had heard before. "What can I help you with?" For a moment, I hesitated to answer. My instinct told me that I should not stay there, but my mind was looking for a reasonable explanation. "We wanted a room to spend the night," I said, stuttering slightly. The man still felt with that stiff smile on his face. He handed us a key and pointed to some stairs at the back. "Room 201, that rest well." When I took the key, his hand brushed mine. It was freezing, as if there was no blood running through his veins. My wife looked at me desperately. Her fear was palpable, and it was beginning to become mine. We climbed the stairs in silence, trying to ignore the echo. The walls of the hallway had old portraits, but they all looked out of place. The people in them also had those strange smiles, as if they were doomed to that expression. When we finally got to the room, I locked the door and looked at my wife. "This is not right. Something is going on here," I said, trying to stay calm. She felt, and her eyes began to fill with tears. Suddenly a bang loud resounded at the door. We both froze. "Who is it?" I asked with a broken voice. The answer was immediate. A deep voice and choral said, "Good night." The knock on the door resounded in my mind like an endless echo. My heart was pounding as I tried to think of what to do. My wife clung to me, terrified, while that monotonous voice repeated from the other side of the door, "Good night." The voice seemed to come from several people at the same time, as if all the villagers were on the other side. I approached the door, trying to control the trembling in my hands, and looked through the peephole. What I saw left me speechless. There were dozens of them. The same people we had seen in the streets were now in front of our door, squeezed into the narrow hallway. They were all smiling, their faces frozen in that macabre expression. With empty eyes fixed on the door, it seemed that they knew I was watching them, because they began to raise their hands in a slow, synchronized greeting. I immediately backed away. My wife began to cry silently, hugging herself on the edge of the bed. "We can't stay here. We have to go," I whispered to her. Although I didn't even know how to do it myself, I tried to think of a solution. We could go out the window, but we were in the second floor, and there was no ladder or anything to cushion the fall. While they were evaluating our options, the knocking on the door intensified. It was as if they knew we were discussing our escape. Suddenly the knocking stopped, and absolute silence filled the atmosphere, which was somehow even more terrifying. My wife and I looked at each other, not daring to move. Then we heard a sound, a low creak like that of an old door opening, but it was coming from the closet at the back of the room. The air became heavy, and I felt a cold sweat run down my back. I walked slowly to the closet, fearing what I might find. When I was just a few steps away, the closet door slammed open. Inside there was nothing, at least nothing visible. However, a strange smell like damp wood and something rotten filled the air. "My wife!" she screamed, and when I turned to her, I saw something that froze my blood. One of those people was inside the room. It was right behind my wife, with completely motionless, with her macabre smile and eyes fixed on me. I screamed, but before I could move, that thing slowly raised a hand pointing at me. My wife reacted and ran away towards me. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I had the impression that Grin was devouring us, that it was observing us as if we were unthinking prey. I grabbed my wife's hand and hurried to the door. I knew we had to leave that chamber, regardless of what was on the other side. The people were still there when I closed the door. They were gathered in the corridor, crowded together, obstructing our progress. The worst of all was their grin, which now seemed even bigger, as if they relished our fear. Their motions were languid, like puppets being directed. "Leave us," I yelled. We ran between them, avoiding eye contact, and I felt their hands slowly rise, as if they wanted to touch us, but they didn't. They were just watching us with that hellish smile. I knew they wouldn't answer, but they moved away, not naturally, but as if sliding sideways, creating a narrow corridor that led to the stairs. When we got to the ground floor, the reception was empty. The front door was open as if they were inviting us to leave. We didn't hesitate. We ran to the car. When I started the engine, I looked through the whole town was there looking at them. They didn't move, but their smiles seemed to shine in the early morning gloom. My wife screamed, "Accelerate." The accelerator says with all my might, and the car skidded on the way out as we drove away. Their presence was oppressive, as if they wanted to make sure you'd never forget that night. When we finally left behind the sign indicating the entrance to town, an immediate relief filled my wife and I looked at each other speechlessly, shaking and with tears in my eyes. But just when I thought it was all over, I heard something that made my blood bleed, a low, whispering voice from the back of the car. The whisper from the back seat made my wife scream, and I almost lost control of the car. I turned my head instinctively as I tried to keep it going. The vehicle on the road was no one. The back seat was empty, but the feeling of a heavy presence filled the air. "You heard that?" I asked in a trembling voice. My wife felt with her eyes full of terror. "What was that?" "There is someone here." I knew we couldn't stop. I stepped on the gas even more, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that cursed town. However, the road seemed longer that before the kilometers felt eternal, as if we were not moving forward. Illuminated something. On the edge of the road it was a motionless human figure looking towards us. Its posture and that smile was unmistakable. It was one of them. My wife let out a choked bland while I swerved the car to avoid it, but as soon as we passed that figure another appeared ahead, and then another one. Seemed that the road was full of them, as if we were. "They are waiting. Don't stop," my wife shouted, clinging to her belly. The figures began to appear not only on the road but also in the fields, on both sides. They stared at us, their smiles shining like reflections in the darkness. I accelerated even more with the car's engine roaring to the limit as I prayed that the road would not end. Finally, after which for a few hours we saw the sign indicating the exit of the road. On the way to the main highway, the sight of the lantern lights, it was like a divine relief. We had escaped, or so we thought. When dawn broke we arrived home exhausted. The sun seemed to give us back some sanity, but the fear still lay dormant. We decided not to talk about what had happened. It was too strange, too scary. We tried to convince ourselves that it had been a collective nightmare, however. I couldn't stay in doubt. That same day, after I asked my Jays if he knew something about what we had seen, he wanted to confirm if it was part of some local tradition or a cultural misunderstanding. His reaction left me cold. San Jacinto del Llano said with a frown. "I never recommended that place. In fact, I have no idea where my skin is." It bristled. How was it possible? I clearly remembered his recommendation weeks before. I thought that perhaps he had forgotten, but something in his expression told me that he wasn't lying. In spite of everything, I didn't want to be left with doubts. The next day, I convinced my wife to come back with me. I promised her that we wouldn't enter the village. I just wanted to see it during the day from the road to check that what we had experienced was real. We drove to the point where the night before we had seen the first lights. When we arrived, something was wrong. The town was not. It was there. Instead of the streets and houses we had walked, there was only a vacant lot. Not a trace of the inn, or the inhabitants, or the entrance sign. The only indication that there was ever anything there, it was an old stone statue in the center of the grounds. It was a human figure, but its face was warped into a sinister smile identical to that of the inhabitants we saw that night. We stood there staring at her in silence, not daring to get closer. It couldn't be possible. We had been here less than 24 hours ago. How could an entire town disappear when we got back to the car? My wife looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Let's never talk about this again," she said. I nodded. I knew it was the best. Years have passed, but that trip continues to torment. I haven't driven at night again, nor have I taken routes that I don't know. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see those faces and their empty smiles. I feel that they are watching me from some dark corner of my memory. And sometimes, when I am alone at home, I swear to hear a distant whisper that says good night. It was a cool October morning when I decided to take a job in a remote region of northern Mexico. I had spent years traveling and working in different areas. But this time the destination was different. The offer came through a social media group that connected farm workers with employers across the country. What attracted me was the opportunity to escape the routine and immerse myself in a whole new experience. The job would be on a ranch located in the hills near the Sierra Madre Occidental. The ranch owner I will call Don Aurelio to protect his identity. He was a reserved man who seemed to value discretion more than detailed explanations. His proposal included working from the end of October to January, just what I needed to avoid the cold winter of my region of origin. When I arrived at the ranch, I was amazed by the landscape. The mountains rose imposingly, covered with dense vegetation that barely let the sunlight through. The silence of the place was only interrupted by the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional birdsong. However, there was something in the air that was unsettling, as if the hills themselves were watching every movement. During the first few weeks, my tasks consisted of preparing the fields for planting. I spent hours driving a tractor over uneven terrain, often working late into the night. Cell phone signals were non-existent in that area, so that we depended on communication radios to keep us in touch, although these radios were not entirely reliable. They were used to coordinate activities. One night around 11 a.m., while I was finishing a field, a peculiar sound coming from the radio was the characteristic click that indicated that someone had pressed the button to talk. Intrigued, I looked at the device, but there was no one on the other end. Just as I was going to turn it off, a soft laugh and Clara resounded through the loudspeaker. It was the laughter of a little girl, followed by a voice that asked, "Do you like to play here?" I froze. There were no children on the ranch, much less in the nearby hills. Besides, the clarity of the voice suggested that I was a few meters away, which was impossible considering the remoteness of the place. I turned off the radio and decided to finish my work earlier than planned. While I was returning to the ranch, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, feeling that something or someone was watching me from the darkness. To the next morning, I shared the experience with one of the mechanics of the ranch. This man, known for his pragmatism and skepticism, listened to me attentively. Instead of mocking, his expression became serious. "Things happen here that are better not to try to understand," he finally said as the days went by. Other workers approached to ask about what happened. None of them showed disbelief. On the contrary, they seemed to share a kind of silent complicity. Finally, it was Don Aurelio who looked for me one afternoon while we were resting. With his 80 years and a whole life in those mountains, his opinion seemed the most accurate. After listening to my story, he simply smiled and said, "The hills have memory. Here we have seen things that cannot be explained. Only you." I say one thing: never answer. And you hear that voice again. Since then, every time I work in the hills, I can't help but feel that there is something beyond what the eyes can see, something that has been there for generations, watching, waiting for the mountains with their imposing beauty hide secrets that will probably never be revealed. I had decided to take some time to travel through the interior of Mexico for a few weeks, enjoying unknown landscapes, and away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I had a small trailer attached to my truck where I lived. During the trip, I usually parked in public areas or improvised camps. It was a way that filled me with peace until one night everything changed. Towards the end of my tour, I began to return towards the starting point. Unfortunately, that day I had a mechanical problem that took me almost the whole day to solve. When I finally got back on the road, the sun had already set and I was way behind in my journey. I made a brief stop at a gas station for coffee and decided to drive at least 2 more hours before I found a place to spend the night. The road was deserted. There were hardly any vehicles passing through. I used an app to find a nearby point where I could camp. The place seemed ideal. It was a public land on one side of the road. The road with a dirt road that went into about 700 met in the woods. At the end there was a small clearing surrounded by trees, completely isolated. When I arrived, it was already past 11 p.m. I parked my truck on the edge of the clearing in front of the exit to be prepared in case I needed to leave quickly. I got into the trailer and began to getting ready for sleep. The night was quiet, and everything was completely quiet until a flash of light came through the window curtains. I sat down suddenly and raised the curtain a little to look at the headlights of a vehicle illuminated the dirt road as it slowly approached. It was an old and rusty truck. When it reached the clearing, it stopped, but it did not turn around or turn off the headlights. Something in that situation I found it disturbing. After a few minutes, I saw the door of the vehicle open. 2 men went outside and turned off the lights. I could barely make out their silhouettes in the darkness, but they seemed to be carrying something in their hands. They tried to move stealthily, walking towards my trailer. My heart began to beat quickly when I heard their footsteps approaching. One of them spoke in a harsh voice. "Could you help us? "We need directions," from the tone of his voice seemed to be drunk, or maybe I was pretending I didn't answer. I peeped through a small gap in the curtain and saw that one of them was holding what appeared to be a heavy tool like a hammer or a metal bar. The other came even closer and started scraping something against the trailer door, trying to force it, pressing my legs against the door, trying to keep it closed, while my mind desperately searched for a solution. Just then a sharp sound broke the silence of the night, a shot coming from the forest. The men stopped in secco, looked towards the trees, and without saying a word ran back to their truck. In less than a minute they had started and disappeared along the dirt road. I took advantage of the moment to quickly get out of the trailer and get into my truck. While I looked towards the trees, but I saw no one. The origin the shot was still a mystery. I drove non-stop until I reached a gas station where I was finally able to relax a little. To this day, I don't know who or what fired that night. Maybe it was a hunter or someone else camping who saw what was happening and decided to intervene. The only thing I know is that that shot saved my life. For as long as I can remember, I have always been passionate about terror. I'm looking for the next story that manages to put my skin together, whether in books, movies, or oral stories. However, I never thought that I would be the protagonist of an experience as inexplicable as the one I'm about to narrate. This story happened in 2021 in a remote corner of Mexico known as the Hill of the Butterflies, a place that keeps secrets that I still try to understand. It all started as a simple plan. My friend Adrian, a landscape photographer like me, invited me on a hike to capture the nature of the place. So as not to go, I invited my best friend Rodrigo and other acquaintances. The idea was to enjoy a quiet weekend out of the city. We rented a cabin in front of the hill, a small rustic shelter run by a lovely elderly couple. Since our arrival, Mrs. Clara, the owner, spoke to us about strange sightings in an area known as Los Melizos. Although he commented these stories naturally, there was something in his eyes that worried me. The first day went smoothly, but the second day things began to get stranger due to a delay in the itinerary. The planned hike ended up taking place at night. Rodrigo, adventurer and lover of the paranormal like me, was the only one who decided to accompany me. It was around 10 when we gathered with a small group who knew the place. We took the so-called Senda del Venado, a narrow path that wound between immense trees and moss-covered rocks. As we advanced, the darkness became absolute. We depended completely on our flashlights that barely managed to make their way through the shadows. One of the guides, an older man from the nearby village, began to tell us stories about accidents and disappearances on the hill. According to him, many reckless visitors, they ended up lost or needed to be rescued. He also mentioned a local legend, an evil spirit that punished those who dared to explore the place without respect. Although these stories seemed designed to scare us, Rodrigo and I took them as simple anecdotes. We had faced dangerous situations before and always found a way to get by. After an hour of walking, we arrived at a natural viewpoint. From there, you could see the sleeping village under a lot full of stars. The others began to take photos, but something made me put my camera away. I felt restless, as if someone was watching us from the thicket. Rodrigo must have perceived the same, because he suggested that we move away from the group a little to explore. We walked a few meters into the forest until we found a small clara among the trees. What we saw there was disconcerting. In the middle of absolute darkness, a triangle, luminous, was drawn on the ground. The light that formed it had no apparent source and was of a soft but hypnotic silver tone. It was geometrically perfect, as if someone had traced it with a divine ruler. Rodrigo and I exchanged a look full of disbelief. I tried to look for a logical explanation, perhaps the moonlight filtering through the branches, but there were no irregularities in the shadows. It was impossible that it was a natural phenomenon. Neither of us dared to approach us. We tried to illuminate the triangle with our flashlights, but both started flashing even though we had checked the batteries before leaving. Something or someone didn't want us to take a closer look. We went back with the group and tried to explain what we had seen, but no one seemed to take it seriously. Some told us we were probably imagining things, but Rodrigo and I knew that that was real. We decided to stay with the group, although the discomfort was still latent. Rodrigo and I could not stop casting furtive glances towards the thicket, looking for the luminous triangle that we had left behind. There was something in that place that kept us on alert, as if nature itself was so much of our presence and wanted to warn us of something. When we began the descent of the hill, the lanterns worked normally again, which had further increased our confusion. Rodrigo remained silent, something unusual for him, who always found something to comment on our adventures. I didn't want to talk either. I felt that if we said something, you would break a fragile balance that kept us safe. Later on, the group decided to pause to take more photos, this time experimenting with an arc of light. This implied paying for all the flashlights to better capture the shots, while the others. Rodrigo approached me uncomfortably, whispered that I needed to move a few meters away to go to the bathroom, although we have always been very respectful with the places we visited. On this occasion there was no alternative. I was waiting between the group and the thicket, trying to stay calm. The darkness was absolute, and the only sound that broke the silence was the rustling of the leaves under the feet of the others. Passed by a few minutes, and I began to worry about Rodrigo's tardiness. Suddenly I heard a dry noise through the trees, as if someone was running towards me. I turned on my flashlight and directed it. The origin of the sound was Rodrigo, who came running as if his life depended on it. He was pale, with his eyes bulging and breathing erratically. He could hardly speak. When he managed to calm down enough, he told me what he had seen. He found a secluded spot among the trees to have some privacy. While he was there, he heard a strange sound with a whisper accompanied by slowly approaching footsteps. He turned on his flashlight and directed it towards the place where the noise was coming from. What he saw left him paralyzed. They were pale feet, white as paper, but they did not look human. The fingers were elongated and twisted, and the movement of the legs was clumsy, almost unnatural. When he felt the light, the thing began to move towards him with an inhuman R, producing a guttural noise that froze the blood. Rodrigo did not stay to find out what it was. He ran back to me, as fast as he could. We both decided that we had had enough for that night. We insisted that the group finish the photos quickly, inventing an excuse about the time so as not to worry them. We finally resumed on the way back to the cabin. During the journey, neither Rodrigo nor I said another word about what had happened. The stress started to gradually ease as we got to the cabin. Our buddies, who hadn't heard or seen anything odd, attempted to calm us down by telling us amusing tales, but Rodrigo and I couldn't stop thinking about what we had seen that evening. Both of us had the impression that something was happening as we slept. Watching us from the hill, the next morning, when we handed over the keys to the cabin, Mrs. Clara stopped us. She told me that she had tried to call me the night before, but that she had not been able to contact me. It seemed strange to me because I always carry my cell phone with me. Then she added something that left me cold. I wanted to warn her that the lights reappeared on the nose. If she looks out the window, she can see Rodrigo and I. We looked at each other in silence, not knowing what to answer. The lights would be the triangle we had seen or something else. After saying goodbye to Mrs. Clara, we decided to take one last look towards the hill before leaving. From the window of the cabin you could see the nose partially illuminated by the light of dawn, but there was no trace of the supposed lights that she mentioned. This only increased our uneasiness. What was it that she had seen? Why we couldn't find any sign of it on the way back to the city? Rodrigo and I remained silent, each in his own thoughts, knowing that what we had experienced was not normal, but talking about it at the time seemed inappropriate, as if giving words could be the even more real experience. However, days later, when we met to review the photographs we had taken, something unexpected came to light. While reviewing the images of the Mirador, we noticed that in some of the photos small luminous orbs appeared floating in the air. At first we thought that they could be reflections of the flashlights or dust particles, but when we enlarged in the image, we realized that those lights had defined, almost geometric shapes. One of them in particular, it looked like a triangle similar to the one we had seen in the Clara. Rodrigo and I exchanged nervous glances. These photos were the only tangible proof of what happened, but they would be enough to convince someone else. We decided not to show them to others. At least for the moment, it was something we still needed to process. The weeks passed, but Rodrigo confessed to me that he had begun to have recurring nightmares with the pale feet that he saw that night in his dreams. The figure to which they belonged slowly emerged from the shadows, always on the verge of revealing itself completely, but it never did. I, for my part, could not get the luminous triangle out of my head. Its geometrical perfection and the way it seemed to be the laws of nature tormented me. I finally decided to investigate more about the area known as Los Melizos and their stories. What I found was as terrifying as it was fascinating. According to local accounts, the place had been considered a point of high supernatural activity for generations. It was said that in the past the ancient inhabitants avoided that area, considering it a portal to another world. Strange lights and figures were frequent, and those who dared to desecrate the in the first place, they used to experience disturbing phenomena. The most disturbing of all was to discover that in 1998 a group of hikers disappeared near the path of the deer, just in the same area where we had seen the triangle. Their bodies were never found, and although the authorities closed the case for lack of evidence, the locals assured that something in the forest had claimed them today. When I remember that experience, I cannot help but feel a mixture of fascination and terror. Rodrigo and I have decided not to return to Butterfly Hill despite our adventurous nature. We know that some things are better left in mystery. However, I keep wondering what would have happened if we had dared to enter the Clara that night. What was it that seemed to be watching us from the shadows? Although we will never have clear answers, I hope that by sharing this story someone else can recognize something, and perhaps to shed some light on the mystery that marked us that night. I have never had the courage to tell this event before, perhaps because I always try to find a logical explanation, although sometimes I simply do not find it. This happened when I lived in a quiet neighborhood in the state of Mexico, surrounded by housing complexes and buildings that had been built in the 70s. The houses were modest but full of life, and the neighborhood, although simple, had its own encanto. When I was 12 years old, most of my friends lived in those housing complexes. We spent the afternoons playing in the patios and corridors that looked like huge labyrinths for us. One night around 9 we were still playing, when suddenly everything went dark. The electricity was gone as if it were a sign. All my friends ran to take refuge in their apartments. I instead. He lived in a house a little further away, outside the complex. He had no choice but to walk back alone, in the middle of a darkness that seemed absolute. That night was different. There were no stars. Not even the lights of the cars were distinguishable. Everything was silent, an unsettling silence. He walked extremely carefully, feeling the ground with his feet so as not to trip. He tried to follow the narrow cement road that it took me to the exit of the set, but the Panama seemed to consume everything. It was then, when I turned a corner, I saw a light. It was dim like the faint glow of an old lantern. As I approached, I distinguished the figure of an old man who seemed to be looking for something on the ground. When he saw me, he looked up and with a deep but kind voice, he told me, "Son, what are you doing here?" It's very dark. Before I could reply, invited me to enter his apartment. At that time, I didn't think too much about it. In the colonia, everyone knew each other, and it was not uncommon for adults to help children in situations like this. Besides, the idea of staying in the dark was not attractive at all. So I accepted. The apartment was catching, dominated only by candles that gave a warm glow to the place. Outside it was cold, but inside you felt a warmth. There was a small family, the Lord, a young man of about 16 years old and a girl who looked to be about 7 years old. While I was served a hot coffee, the man commented, "It's dangerous to walk around here in the dark. I don't even let the girl go near the window when she's like this. Even going to the market is risky." I thought her statements were over the top, but I remained silent. The young man asked me my name and we talked a little bit. Just a few minutes later, the lights came back. I said goodbye hurriedly. "Thank you for your hospitality." Before leaving, the Lord gave me a coin and told me to use it to go home. "Take care of yourself a lot." I left the group feeling a strange relief. As soon as I crossed the exit, everything changed. The silence broke. Suddenly, I could hear the sound of the cars, feeling the wind on my face. It was as if I had come from another. A few days later, while I was thinking about the kindness of that family, I felt that returning the coin would be a fair gesture. Besides, I was curious to know more about them. So I went back to the housing complex and I walked to the building where I remember the apartment was. I went up the steps, stopping in front of the door. It was a common door like all the others, but there was something about it that worried me, even though I couldn't explain why. With a little nervousness, I knocked 3 times. A few seconds passed and no one answered. While I was deciding whether to touch again, a woman came out of a nearby apartment and looked at me curiously. "Who are you looking for, child?" "I am looking for the Lord who lives here," I answered. "He helped me the other night and I wanted to give him back something he gave me." The woman frowned, confused. "Here," she repeated, pointing to the door. I nodded. She stayed in silence for a moment, as if trying to find the right words, and finally he said, "Nobody lives here, child. That apartment has been unoccupied for years." Hearing that, I felt as if the floor disappeared under my feet. My heart began to beat strongly and an inexplicable cold ran down my back. It can't be a babble. I was here. A few days ago there was a family, a man, a young man and a little girl. The woman, he shook his head, clearly bewildered. "I assure you there's no one living here. That place has been abandoned for as long as I can remember." The world around me became blurred. I leaned against the wall, trying to process what I'd just heard. The woman's voice sounded far away as she told me something else, but I couldn't concentrate. I could only think about the candles, the warmth of the apartment, and the coin that I still had it in my pocket when I finally managed to move. I awkwardly said goodbye to the woman and left the building. I looked for my friends who lived nearby to ask them if they knew anything about the family in the apartment. However, they all gave me the same response. No one had lived there for a long time, and some even said that this place had a reputation for being cursed, so many people avoided going near it, especially at night. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the coin the man had given me. It was an ordinary coin, nothing special, but its presence made me uneasy. I remembered exactly what I had gone through, the conversation, and the hot coffee, which couldn't have been my imagination. However, I couldn't help but think about how no one else had heard about them years later, because every time I pass that housing complex, I can't help but look toward the apartment, and the door remains as if no one has touched it since. Despite my best efforts to convince myself that it was all a misunderstanding or confusion, I can't help but feel a chill every time I think about it. My sister received a job offer in Guadalajara a few months ago, and although she lives hours away, she tries. I must admit that I enjoyed the quiet of the room when she wasn't there, but it was strange not to have to listen to her conversations on the phone or deal with the mess she always left behind. I prefer to remain anonymous because I may never fully understand what actually happened that night. I am not someone who feels comfortable having her name published online, but what I am going to tell you has been weighing it less. However, that has changed lately, and what first seemed to be a transient and minor circumstance has now become something that frightens me. About 3 years ago, it all began. Weeks despite my tendency to sleep a lot, my sister's cat has a habit of scratching the door every night, demanding that we let her in to sleep. My sister was the one who got up to open it, but since she left that task, it's my turn. That first night, I remember hearing the scratches on the door, so I got up without giving it much thought and groped in the dark until I found the handle. The kitten entered and, as usual, settled down on the bed next to me. I don't mind that she does so, and I don't question the reasoning, but then something struck me like a bucket of cold water. If my sister was there, why hadn't she opened the door to let the cat in? Even worse, I recalled that she had returned to Guadalajara on Sunday night, so I tried to convince myself that everything had a logical explanation. However, the more conscious I became, the more irrational the fear became. I don't know how long it was before sleep overcame me, but I vowed that this would be the last time something like this happened. However, that same week, in the early hours of Thursday morning, it happened again, but this time it was much worse, and that Thursday night I went to bed feeling restless. Despite my best efforts to reassure myself that it had all been a misunderstanding, a part of me couldn't forget that heavy breathing, so I chose to put a small lamp beside my bed to help me relax. After midnight, my sister's cat clawed the door as usual, so I let her in. She hopped into my bed and cuddled up with me. But that calmness did not last long because I should have gone to sleep, but I was startled awake by a strange feeling that made me feel as though someone was watching me. My room was completely silent except for the faint purr of the cat, so I opened my eyes and stared up at the ceiling, trying to tell myself that it was all in my head. Then I heard it, that deep, heavy breath that seemed to come from my sister's bed. I tried not to move, thinking it was just a bad dream, but the more I listened, the more real it felt. The breathing was steady, as if someone was lying there peacefully, resting, and my entire body tensed when I noticed something even stranger. Her eyes were focused on my sister's bed, and the cat, who usually slept soundly, was rigid with her ears perked. Then I heard her bed's mattress crack as if someone was getting out of bed. The sounds of sluggish footsteps filled the room, and I felt my throat tighten, preventing me from screaming. Something seemed to be quietly approaching me and taking pleasure in my fear. Those footsteps halted just next to my bed, and I'm not sure how much time had elapsed. I felt as if someone was hovering over me, but my breathing was hardly audible, trying not to call attention to whatever was there. Something told me it was me, but I dared not open my eyes. I was observing when, as if it had turned around, a slight whisper of air blasted in my face. When I got back to my sister's bed, I heard the wood cracking on the floor. The mattress sunk back down, and then there was stillness. I spent the remainder of the night awake. The cat, who had never acted in such a manner, stayed still beside me until the first rays of the sun illuminated the room. When fear finally made it possible for me to move, I went straight to the living room and spent the rest of the day there. I didn't tell my parents about it because I thought they might not believe in these things, and I was afraid they would think I was going crazy, but it wasn't the last time. This has happened at least twice more since then, and each time has been more unsettling than the last. The worst part is that the cat no longer scratches the door at night. She only enters when I am in the room with her, and when she does, she stays awake as if she senses my presence. I've tried to avoid being alone in my room as much as possible since that night, but there are always times when I can't help but go back to that place where I feel strange and threatening. A few days ago, though, something happened that made my fear go to a whole new level. On a Sunday night, my sister had returned to Guadalajara as usual, and my parents were already asleep. I was trying to read a book in my bed to divert my attention when I noticed that the cat wasn't in her usual spot, so I looked at the door and saw her sitting on the threshold, staring into the dark hallway. Her tail was wagging nervously from side to side, and her ears were erect, as if she was waiting for something. I asked her in a low voice, even though I knew she wasn't. I was about to respond when her body tightened and her gaze shifted to something in the dark outside the corridor. Then I heard it, a faint sound, a crunch, like someone walking barefoot on a hardwood floor, coming slowly, each step more distinct than the one before, my pulse pounding so forcefully that I thought it would burst from my breast. The cat darted to hide under my bed after turning abruptly toward me as if to warn me of something. My body did not react to my desire to get up and flee. I froze, immobile. The air became chilly, almost frigid, as the footsteps approached my room's door, and I felt that presence once more, as strong as before, but this time it didn't halt at my bed. Sister. This time she entered the room. I felt as though the weight of something invisible was shifting around the space, as though I was searching for something. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping that everything would stop, but my fear prevented me from focusing on anything. Suddenly, the bed creaked beside me, and something had sat right on the edge, so close that I could feel the mattress moving slightly under its weight. I don't know how long it seemed like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the weight vanished, and I heard footsteps leaving the room, this time disappearing into the hallway. The silence returned, but I dared not open my eyes until dawn. I now sleep in the living room with all the lights on, like I did the last time I slept in my room. Entering the room since then, he doesn't even come near the door. I haven't told anyone this, but I needed to share it with someone, even if it's anonymously. I don't know what's going on or what else it could be. I just hope this ends someday, because I don't know how much longer I'll be able to endure. That summer I lived with my parents in their house located in a quiet neighborhood of Mexico City. I worked part-time in a small convenience store. A few blocks from the house, the suffocating heat mixed with a monotonous routine of work, and the days passed without major news. Everything seemed quiet until one night I received a strange message on my Instagram account. The sender was a man who was clearly much older than me. His profile was limited, a couple of pink photos and a generic name. The message said simply hello. I ignored the greeting without thinking too much about it. For years I had received messages from random people on social networks, and my usual response was to ignore them. Generally, those people did not send more messages when they did not get a response, but this man was different. The next day, a second message arrived. "Why don't you answer me?" Then a third notification lit up the screen of my phone. Now I felt a slight discomfort. His insistence was uncomfortable. I decided to block him and assumed that everything would end there, but I was wrong. The next morning, while checking Facebook, I noticed a new friend request. It was him again. I contemplated the option to block immediately, but I decided to ignore it for the time being. Hours later, when I checked my notifications again, I saw that I had liked several of my posts and had commented on photos that had been uploaded for years. Comments such as "You are beautiful" and "Accept me, please" invaded my profile. I felt a mixture of anger and fear. I deleted all traces of his activity and blocked him also on that platform for a few days. Everything seemed to calm down. I went back to my routine and started to forget about the matter. But one afternoon while I was working in the store, something happened that froze my blood. I was at the cash register when I noticed that a man entered without taking any product. When he approached, my heart skipped a beat. It was him. His face matched the blurry profile picture he remembered with a tense smile. He greeted me and casually mentioned the blocks on Facebook and Instagram. He said something like, "I don't understand why you ignore me. I'm a good guy." My mind was working at 1,000 per hour while trying to stay calm. Until that moment I had assumed that he was someone who lived far away, maybe in another city. It never occurred to me that I couldn't be so close. When he asked what time I was leaving work, I didn't answer. Instead, I asked him to leave. His expression changed. He seemed offended. "What's your problem?" he asked. But finally he turned around and walked out. Although he was gone, I didn't feel safe. I saw him from the corner of the counter, prowling the aisles of the store, pretending to check the products but giving me furtive glances. He stayed there for at least half an hour, and then, without buying anything, he finally came out that night. I told my boss what happened. He asked me to let him know if the man came back, but at least for the next few days he didn't come back. What happened next turned my life into a nightmare. A few days passed since that encounter in the store. Even though I tried hard to stay calm, I couldn't help but constantly look over my shoulder. Even the safety of my house. My parents used to be late because of their jobs. So many times I was alone. The tranquility of my home now felt like a fragile bubble about to burst. That afternoon I got home after closing the store around 8. The night was cool and the streets of the neighborhood were unusually quiet. I closed the doormain with double key. And let's make sure his presence was unreal, as if it had materialized out of nowhere. How he had found my house had been following me. My mind could not process what he was seeing, but my body reacted immediately. I turned off the lights in the living room and ran to my room, taking the cell phone. On the way, I dialed the emergency number with trembling hands. The operator attended me with a calm which contrasted with my broken voice. I explained to him that a man who had been harassing me on social media was now outside my house. He asked me to stay on the line while he sent a patrol car. I followed his instructions, trying not to make a noise. From my bedroom window I could see the main entrance. He was still there, now banging harder. The minutes felt eternal. From the blows they stopped. I saw him move towards the side of the house, disappearing from my sight. My anxiety soared. I was looking for a way to get in. I was going to force a window. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows that were projected in the back garden. Then I heard a thud in the yard. It wasn't a bang, but something more disturbing, as if something was laughing or tearing. I crept over to the back window of my room and saw it there. I was in the garden, sitting on the ground with a piece of glass in my hand, his face reflecting a terrifying calm, as he cut the skin from his arms and legs in slow, almost ceremonial motions. Before I could process what I was seeing, the red and blue lights lit up the street. The police had arrived. I came out of hiding and opened the door carefully, pointing towards the back garden. The officers, they were still there, muttering unintelligible things, while blood dripped from his wounds. The policemen acted quickly, surrounding him while one of them ordered him to drop the glass. The man looked up in surprise, as if he didn't understand why they were there. Then he began to murmur something, broken words that he couldn't make out from where he was. Finally, he dropped the glass and allowed it to be exposed without resistance. His face was still expressionless, as if everything I had done was unimportant. After securing the area, one of the officers approached me to take my statement with his hands still shaking. I told him all the messages on social networks, his presence in the store, and how he had gotten to my house. As I explained everything, the officer nodded thoughtfully and gave me his word that I would be safe that evening and that the guy would be brought to the station for interrogation and evaluation. Every sound in the house made me jump, and I couldn't sleep at all, even after the stalker had been caught. I kept asking myself, how long had he been following me? I was unaware of other information. The police called me the next morning to let me know that the guy had previously been the subject of harassment reports and had a history of compulsive behavior. Although no one knew the precise location, it seemed that I had landed in Mexico City a few months earlier. In the weeks that followed, I strengthened my security, adjusted the privacy settings on all of my social media accounts, and removed any postings that may have disclosed personal information. Even though I never heard from him again, my parents made sure I was never alone by installing security cameras around the home. On my darkest nights, I could feel his eyes following me through the windows. His shadow remained with me. That event taught me to be always vigilant and to not undervalue the threats that may be concealed behind a screen. even if I thought it was impossible. In my early years, I experienced an event that still shivers me to this day. In October 1989, my mother and I had moved into a modest home outside of Guadalajara. The nation was embroiled in wars at the time, and we had to deal with instability on a daily basis. Even though we were used to the continual terror that night, the evenings in the region where we were filled with the echo of explosions and helicopters scanning the sky. Just after nightfall on Friday, everything changed. The nighttime curfew caused the electricity to go off. 6 p.m. The relative calm of Saturday was broken just before the curfew began when someone knocked on the door hard. We looked at each other in terror, wondering who could be a man's voice. Rough and full of urgency, she explained to us that they were bringing a coffin and that they needed to leave it in the house. The funeral home, they said, had not been able to locate the family of the deceased, and this house belonged to the general who died in combat the night before. The streets were desolate, and any movement outside the house could be interpreted as a threat, so my mother and I lit candles and tried to distract ourselves. Because of the curfew, the two men spent the night in the funeral home van with the coffin inside the next day. When we finally managed to talk to them more calmly, they told us that the original owner of the house was a high-ranking general who had died during a recent confrontation. My mother remembered that we had spent our time with the general's sister, so she provided them with relieved we thought it was all over there. But we didn't know that the worst was about to begin that night. While we were watching a movie in the room, we heard footsteps in the living room. At first we thought it might be a thief, although it was strange because we always kept everything locked through the crack in the door. We saw a shadow moving from side to side. The steps were heavy, as if someone was using military boots. Then the sound of a gun being engulfed, our blood froze. We remained motionless without making the slightest sound, listening as the person tried to open the door of the room. This lasted for hours, the sound of footsteps, the shadow in movement, and the knob of the door being forced seemed to have no end, and then suddenly everything was completely silent. When dawn broke, we checked the house cautiously. All the doors and windows, they were still locked. It was impossible for anyone to have entered. The second night the scene was repeated, exactly the same. Desperate, my mother called a friend who lived in a nearby town. She did not offer her house as a refuge, and the next day, despite the danger, we managed to get out safely. My mother contacted the general's sister and explained what had happened. Both came to the conclusion that the spirit of the ace soldier could be tormented, unable to find rest. A priest, he was called to bless the house and offer prayers for the general's soul. Although things seemed to calm down, my mother and I decided to move definitively. Sometime later we emigrated to another country, leaving behind that house and the dark memories it harbored. We never heard again from that place or the spirit that had terrified us since I was a child. I have always had episodes of paralysis of the eye dreamed, but I never considered them out of the ordinary. My parents reassured me that it was harmless. I had never experienced hallucinations, just that unsettling feeling of being awake, unable to move. However, there was one night in particular when I was 11 years old that marked my life forever. After a restful weekend, my parents urged me to get ready for bed at 9 o'clock on a Monday night. As a habit, they turned off all the lights in the house while I settled into my bed, hugging my favorite stuffed animal tightly. A worn-out bunny, but full of meaning for me. I fell asleep like any other night without imagining what awaited me. I woke up suddenly, not knowing why. In the middle of the darkness of my room something felt different. An unknown restlessness invaded me more intensely than ever. I tried to calm myself by repeating myself that it was nothing until I heard a sound coming from downstairs, soft but clearly perceptible steps. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was my dad who sometimes stayed up late, but these steps were different. The sounds became clearer. They went up the stairs. They did it deliberately, slowly, as if the person was trying not to make noise. My heart began to pound as I tried to calm my thoughts. Footsteps stopped right in front of my bedroom door. I held my breath. I remembered what my parents always told me. If I ever had hallucinations during sleep paralysis, I should repeat to myself that they weren't real, just a dream. I closed my eyes tightly and repeated those words to myself over and over again. After a minute, I mustered up the courage to open my eyes, hoping that the supposed dream would be real. But then the door began to open slowly with a creak that echoed in the silence. I could barely breathe from fear. In the frame appeared the silhouette of a man looking at himself with a chilling calm. I closed my eyes again, praying that it would end soon. But the footsteps continued getting closer and closer. I could feel his presence next to me, his heavy breathing on my shoulder. With terror paralyzed, I heard myself lifting my stuffed animal from the bed. The footsteps moved away again, towards the back of the room. Despite the fear, I opened my eyes slightly and saw the man taking my stuffed animal while he closed the door as slowly as he had opened it. Everything was silent, but I was still motionless, fighting against a whirlwind of terrifying thoughts. I don't remember how, but I finally fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, a strange relief ran through me when I realized that I was safe in my bed. Everything seemed normal until I looked for my bunny and I didn't find him. At that moment, all the anxiety of the previous night came back. I ran to my parents' room sobbing while I explained what happened. My dad, although bewildered, tried to calm me down. He told me that I had probably lost the stuffed animal during the night and that we would find it. We checked my room, then the whole house, but the stuffed animal did not appear. My father, with the intention of reassuring me, continued the search. But it was useless. We never found it to this day. I don't know if what I experienced was a hallucination product of sleep paralysis or something much more sinister. The only thing I know is that that night something or someone was in my room. In the years in which I served as a soldier, I lived moments that still haunt me. This is one of them. It was an early morning at the end of November. The cold penetrated to the bone on the road that connects Ensenada with Tecate, Baja California. At that time, my unit had an inspection post on a lonely stretch of the route where cars rarely passed after midnight. We were all attentive but relaxed until the lights of a car approaching at high speed alerted us. It was a small vehicle, a worn-out sedan from which an older woman and a young woman both cried hurriedly. Their faces reflected a panic that seemed to tear the soul apart. "They have to help us," exclaimed the eldest with a broken voice. "We had just seen a horrible accident. A car overturned. There are bodies all over the road." The girl felt frantic, pointing to an undetermined point ahead. Due to the seriousness of what they were saying, the emergency services were notified and a group of us got into the vehicles to go to the place they described. As we advanced, the silence of the road was overwhelming. There was no trace of any accident, no debris on the road or marks on the asphalt. We stopped at the exact place they had indicated, but we found nothing, absolutely nothing. Shortly after, the same car came behind us. The women got out in a hurry, looking around with desperation. "Here it was, I'm sure it was here," shouted the young woman as they both walked around the place, almost frantically. I watched them suspiciously. Something didn't add up. They moved from side to side as if they were looking for something that they knew they weren't going to find. An uncomfortable suspicion settled in my mind. I approached them, this time firmly. "What's going on here? What do they want?" I asked them, letting my anger show. Older woman shook her head, almost begging. "We're not lying, I swear. We saw it with our own eyes." Just as my irritation was about to overflow, one of my companions tapped me on the shoulder. "Calmly," said calmly. "Not this. It makes sense, but it doesn't seem like they're lying." Both women, still shaking, got back into their car and drove off as their vehicle disappeared into the distance. My partner asked me to accompany him to inspect the surroundings. We moved about 50 meters away from the place where we had parked, illuminating the road with our flashlights. It was then that the flickering light of his lamp stopped at something on the side of the road. There were several crossings, wooden crosses worn by time, some decorated with March flowers, were marks that indicated a place where apparently a tragic accident had occurred. When returning to the post, we reported that it was a false alarm. However, there was something that did not fit. The ambulance, despite having been warned, it never arrived at the scene. The days passed and the incident continued to go around in my mind. Las Cruces, the desperate women, and the lingering feeling that something on that road was out of place. One afternoon, while I was buying groceries at a small store in front of the inspection post, strikes up with the owner, an older man with a weathered face and a wise look. Not knowing how to approach the subject, I mentioned the strange event of that early morning. The man stared at me as if he was evaluating whether he should tell me something. Finally, he sighed and began to speak in a low voice, almost as if he feared that someone else might hear us. "It's not the first time something like this has happened on that stretch," he said, pausing to make sure he listened carefully. "From time to time someone appears here pale as a ghost, saying that he saw a terrible accident. They always describe the same thing. An overturned car, bodies on the road." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Always in the same place?" I asked. although I already knew the answer. The man nodded slowly. Exactly where the crosses are. Many years ago an entire family died in an accident. They say it was a dreadful tragedy. The car lost control and overturned, leaving no one alive. Since then those who are sensitive or unlucky. See what you just told me? I tried to rationalize what he was saying, looking for a logical explanation, but something in his words and in the certainty with that he pronounced them made me doubt. That same night I could not sleep. The words of the man resounded in my mind, and a restlessness led me to leave the post and walk towards the place of Las Cruces. The road was deserted and the wind blew with a whistle that seemed to come from everywhere. When I arrived I turned on my flashlight and passed it over Las Cruces. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but the atmosphere, it was suffocating. I felt that someone or something was watching me from the darkness. I was about to return, when I heard something. It was a distant sound, like the screech of a car braking sharply. Then a rumble. The flashlight trembled in my hand as it illuminated the road in front of me. A few meters away, the figure of a car appeared for an instant. It was shattered, with the roof crushed, as if it had just overturned next to the car. I could make out human forms, inert bodies that seemed strewn like broken dolls. Panic paralyzed me. I saw a step back and blinked. At that moment everything disappeared. The road was empty, as if nothing had happened. I ran back to the post. My heart held it tight. I didn't say anything to my companions. What could I say? No one would believe me. But that night I knew that something on that road was doomed to repeat itself, an echo of a tragic event that finds no rest. Since then I avoid that route when I can. But there are nights when I close my eyes, I can see Las Cruces again, and the bodies scattered on the road, and the distant sound of the accident continues to haunt me like a whisper that never goes out. I lived in a Modesta house in a quiet neighborhood in Mexico City, sharing it with my older sister. We had rented the place for a little while, dividing the expenses and trying to build a stable routine. This happened in October of last year, just when the weather was starting to get cool, one of those times when the afternoons become longer and the nights more unsettling. My sister had made plans to visit some friends in Guadalajara. She would be away for almost a full week and invited me to accompany her, but my work prevented me from doing so. The end left early on a Monday while I, with the day off, got ready to clean the house and enjoy the time in Soledad. That same day around 2 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the door. I thought it would be some package for my sister, so I went to attend. In front of me, there was a man of about 40 years old, dressed in simple clothes. He did not have anything in his hands, which he did to me. Think maybe I was wrong from home. Where can I help you? I asked, trying to sound nice. He stared at me for an instant that he felt eternally uncomfortable. Finally he said, I just wanted to see who lived here. Sorry for the inconvenience. He handcuffed a strange smile, nodded his head and left without further ado. I closed the door, somewhat uneasy, wondering what I might have wanted. Although his comment didn't make sense, I decided to ignore it and to continue with my day. The rest of the afternoon went normally. So I thought. The next day, Tuesday, I got up early and went to the office. I left at 6 p.m. and arrived home shortly after. As I was making supper, I heard a tap on the door once again. Peeping through the peephole, I saw that it was the same guy, who was dressed precisely as he had been the day before. I pulled the door open. I asked, trying to sound firm, and he smiled again as if my question was an sure. Of course, I just wanted to know how you were, he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the way he said it made me feel even more uneasy. I assumed it was some inquisitive neighbor, and I responded, you're my neighbor. He didn't know. He shook his head, maintaining that smile that was already beginning to give me chills. That just made me feel more uneasy, I said, closing the door quickly with an excuse, and watched him walk away from the kitchen window. That night, I sent a message to my sister, asking if he had met anyone similar in the neighborhood. He replied, no. I tried to relax by telling myself that perhaps I was exaggerating, but the feeling of being watched persisted for the rest of the time. Even though the situation seemed to be behind me, I couldn't help but look out the windows occasionally, as if I expected to see something or someone, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The next few days went by rather calmly. The man didn't show up again, and even though I tried to tell myself that it had all been a coincidence, the uneasiness was still latent. Thursday was the last day my sister would be gone, so I tried to spend the day at home reading and watching YouTube videos. However, my body tensed up instantly when I heard a strange noise coming from the side of the house, which at first sounded like a bush hitting the wall. When I heard hurried footsteps leaving, I got up and cautiously walked up to the window, barely opened the curtains, and saw the shrub immediately below the window moving. My heart raced. I knew there was no wind that night, which made it impossible for the bush to move on its own. I was paralyzed for a moment trying to process what had just happened. It was the same man. How much I had been there for a long time. I felt nauseous imagining him crouching in the bush's spine. I closed the blinds quickly and tried to think of what to do. In my confusion, I decided to call my sister. Luckily, she answered the first doorbell. I tried to explain what was happening, although I was probably talking too fast because she had to ask me to calm down several times while I told her. A loud knock echoed at the front door. My body, he froze the blow. He repeated himself more insistently this time. Then I heard his deep and authoritarian voice asking me to open the door for him. "Please, Nito, help, I'm hurt," he said, trying to sound desperate. Something in his tone seemed false to me, as if he were playing a role. I stood still without answering, but he continued to bang on the door harder, almost in anger. The situation was terrifying. I couldn't understand how anyone could be so determined to enter in a house like that. My sister, still on the call, told me firmly, "Call the police right now. Don't face him with shaking hands." I dialed the emergency number while the man kept screaming and banging on the door. I explained the situation as clearly as possible. They assured me that they would send a patrol immediately. The minutes that passed until the police arrived felt eternal. The man kept insisting, now with a more aggressive tone. He was banging on the door with such force that I feared he might break it. Then suddenly everything went silent. I looked out the side window carefully and watched him run away into the darkness of the street. When the patrol car arrived, the officers checked the perimeter of the house but found no traces of him. They told me to remain alert and so to patrol the area during the night, although his presence calmed me down a bit. I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. That night I could barely sleep despite the locked doors and closed windows. Every little noise made me jump out of bed. I attempted to explain everything to my sister when she eventually arrived home on Friday morning, despite the police having scoured the neighborhood. I couldn't get rid of the idea that he was still out there. We spent the day together trying to keep ourselves occupied and not think too much about what had happened, but the atmosphere was charged that night as we had dinner. My sister and I exchanged glances, held our breaths slowly, and approached the dining room window before he skied through a small opening in the curtain. He was standing in the dim light of a streetlight pole looking straight toward our house. She promised me that she would talk to the owner about improving the locks and possibly installing security cameras after seeing my pale face and the knock marks on the door. When the police arrived, I grabbed a broomstick and banged on the door from inside, screaming hard to get in. The man took a step back, surprised by the reaction, but then slowly raised a hand and pointed towards the window where my sister was standing. It was a slow and deliberate gesture, as if he wanted to make sure we understood. The police checked the area again and found nothing, and that night we both slept in the same room with the furniture blocking the door. I couldn't even close my eyes without reliving that image, the man standing under the light with satisfaction and contempt. Weeks went by without any more incidents, but we never felt safe at all. They installed security cameras and changed the locks, but the fear persisted every time we went outside or walked down the street. Supermarket, we couldn't help but look over our shoulder. The most disturbing thing happened a month later. One of the cameras caught something strange during the early morning. Someone had left a small box on our door. Inside the box there was a crumpled paper with a handwritten message. "I always know who is at home. Since I was a child I was always a rebel. I didn't like to study and I only went to school to play soccer and spend time with my friends. At the age of 15 I decided to leave school. Because I felt that it was not for me. My parents respected my decision but told me that I should look for a job. I accepted the challenge, and it was not long before I found a job in a construction company. I worked there as a bricklayer for 6 years, learning a lot and forging valuable friendships. However, one day my boss informed me that the company had gone bankrupt. With sadness, I was grateful for everything I learned and shared the news with my family. My father and my uncle, both truck drivers with decades of experience, suggested that I join their trade. It is a stable job and you pay well, my father told me after thinking about it for a week. I accepted thanks to their teachings. I already knew how to drive heavy trucks with their good Asian. I had no problems getting a job after looking for a month. An agricultural products company hired me to make deliveries by various routes. The first months passed without setbacks. The routes were quiet and well paid. I felt satisfied with my new job. But everything changed one night in October, during a delivery that I will never forget. That night I had to leave at 10 a.m. to a rural clinic to deliver a shipment of vegetables. I left on time with a deserted road in front of me. It was one of those secluded roads surrounded by a dense forest where darkness seemed to devour everything. I had driven a little more than an hour when I saw something strange on the side of the road, a dark figure coming out of the forest. As I approached, I could make out an almost naked man moving on all fours, like an animal. The most disturbing thing was that he seemed to vomit blood as he advanced. So vandal or a homeless man in bad condition. Worried, I stopped the truck and I went down to help without imagining what was about to happen. When I got closer, the man made a guttural sound as if he was trying to breathe but couldn't. Suddenly he stopped his movements and looked up at me. His eyes were full of indescribable hatred and his feet twisted at impossible angles. They barely supported his body. I wanted to run, but my body did not respond, as if something was keeping my face paralyzed. Suddenly my face, the man began to melt as if acid had been thrown at him. The nauseating smell he gave off was unbearable and his mocking laughter resounded in the darkness. I managed to break the trance and ran towards the truck as soon as I got in. I started at full speed, looking in the rearview mirror as that thing watched me from the side of the road. I thought it was all over, but seconds later, it appeared next to me, running as fast as the truck. Despite his deformed feet, I accelerated even more, feeling how my heart leaped with uncontrolled force. Finally, after a few minutes of chase, disappeared. I arrived at a small fonda, trembling with fear. When I got off the truck, I noticed that I had perfectly outlined claw marks on one side. I entered the place looking for refuge. The other truck drivers looked at me curiously, but noticing my pale face, they began to ask questions. I told them what I had done. They didn't believe me, but to my amazement, several of them claimed to have had similar experiences. These objects are reported to emerge on certain roadways, particularly at night, and others claim that they intentionally cause accidents. One of them said, "I couldn't sleep that night, and even though I've been a truck driver ever since. I only worked for a few months on a ranch on the outskirts of a small town in Mexico. My work was simple, but it required dedication during the day. It wasn't my main task to make sure the cattle stayed inside the corral, away from the predators that roamed the nearby mountains. Living on the ranch meant getting used to the sounds of nature, such as Los Grillos' song, the soft movement of the leaves in the wind, and occasionally the barking of the dogs. It was almost 2 in the morning when I glanced at my watch, but that night everything was strangely quiet. Not even the dogs made a sound, despite if something was coming. It was then that I noticed something strange. One of the cows was moving away from the group, walking erratically as if she had difficulty moving. I thought she could have hurt a leg, or what about once something had stung her. I took my flashlight and went over to check, although there wasn't much I could do. If she was injured, you couldn't leave an animal alone, much less at that time. When I lit her side, I was speechless. On her skin there was a perfectly round hole, as if someone had done it with a precise tool. But the most disturbing thing was that there was not a drop of blood. I got closer to examine it. My first thought was that it might be some kind of peculiar infection or injury, but when I touched it, something froze my blood. The cow was completely motionless, as if I didn't feel it. Suddenly I heard a sound coming from the nearby forest. It wasn't the typical rustling of branches under an animal's legs. It was something different, something that was dragging heavily through the undergrowth. I was petrified, holding the flashlight in one hand and a cane in the other. What emerged from among the trees defied all logic. It was a tall figure of at least 2 m with pale skin that seemed to glow under the light of the flashlight. Even though I couldn't see his face well in the darkness, I saw something frightful. He was eyeless, and he stood there observing me, or at least that's how it seemed at one point. When they regained control, I was lying on the ground with the flashlight still in my hand, but something inside of me had changed. A deep terror had settled in my chest, and I felt my body stop responding. It wasn't fear, but something deeper, something I can't describe, paralyzed me. The creature pointed at me with its hand, and before I could react, I felt a sharp blow on the head, turning everything black. It was grazing peacefully with the others before I passed out, as if nothing had occurred. But I wanted to be sure, so I walked up with shaky feet and looked at its side. Nothing was there. For a moment, I believed it had all been a dream, but then I saw something on the ground that jolted me back to reality. The ground had deep marks, as if something very big and heavy had crawled from where I was to the interior of the forest, and the nearby grass had been flattened, creating a clear, wide trail that vanished between the forest. The silence of the forest was deafening, as if nature itself refused to reveal what had happened that night. I knelt down to take a closer look and saw that the marks appeared to have been made by something that left no typical footprints, such as legs or wheels, but rather a smooth, continuous groove, as if it had slipped away. I looked into the shadows among the trees, but my innermost thoughts told me that it was not to be done. I returned to the corral and found my flashlight on the ground just where I had been standing when I seen the monster. I stooped to pick it up, but an overwhelming feeling that something invisible was watching me halted me in my tracks. The memory of that figure and her vacant eyes was still vivid in my mind. So I didn't wait any longer. My heart was pounding, so I hurried to the ranch, where the doors creaked as I opened them, locked it, and let's check on Music's belongings. He tried to ask me what had happened, but I couldn't explain it, so I told him that I couldn't stay there one more night before I left. I took one last look in the direction of the forest, and even though the day had begun, the memory of the creature persisted. Stalking me, I knew that what I had seen was not an animal or something that could be explained logically. Despite having left the ranch that same day, the memories of what I experienced that night followed me like a shadow for weeks. I could not sleep peacefully. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tall and pale figure emerging from the forest, his long and thin fingers pointing towards me and that dark emptiness where their eyes should be. I tried to forget what had happened, to convince myself that it had all been the product of tiredness or my imagination, but then something strange began to happen. One night as I was walking through the town, I heard a group of older men talking quietly in the cantina. They were telling stories about the forest near the ranch, stories of things that no one could explain. One of them, in a deep and slow voice, told as his grandfather had warned him of a presence in those mountains, something that did not belong to this world. There are things in the bush that we should not try to understand, he said as he drained a drink of his tequila. His words stuck in my mind. A few days later I decided to return to the village in the hope of finding some explanation or perhaps close that chapter of my life. I asked the older inhabitants, and they knew something about the ranch and the strange happenings in the forest. One of them, a gray-haired man with eyes full of stories, took me to a secluded corner of the square and told me what he knew. That place is not safe. It began years ago. A shepherd disappeared right there. His words validated my fears. What I had discovered that night was not a common predator or a hallucination. Rather, it was something that escaped any logical explanation, something that many chose to ignore. They only discovered his belongings lying on the ground and some odd marks on the ground. They said that he lives there, that he is not of this world, that he is not an animal, that he is not a man, that he is something else, something you should not have seen, in order not to attract his attention. Since then I have avoided talking about the subject. Every time someone mentions the ranch, I feel a chill run down my spine. I never set foot near that place again, and although years have passed, the feeling of being watched in the dark has never left me. Sometimes in my dreams I relive that night. I am standing in the corral, the lantern trembling in my hand, and from among the shadows of the forest that figure emerges once more. I always wake up before it reaches me, but the feeling of his presence remains long after opening my eyes. I know that many will not believe this story, that they will think it was a nightmare or a figment of my mind, but I know what I saw, and if you ever find yourself in a forest in the dark with a silence that seems too deep, get away, because something may be watching you from the shadows. Thank you for joining me on this journey full of stories. If you liked it, leave your like and subscribe to not miss more horror stories. And remember, in the description you will find links to everything you need. Our official store, the Members Club for early access and exclusive content, and much more. I am the narrator, and we will see you very soon in the shadows.